How y'all doing? Welcome back. Oh, it's that time again. We got a good one for you. We are going back to ancient Greece. It's been a while since we set foot here.
A long while. Just doing the research for this brought back a lot of like Athens
Yeah,
episode thoughts and
Athens
talk.
in the Greek mythology one.
Yep, that too.
We are talking ancient Sparta today. Sparta, which still exists, essentially has a long, storied history, but we're going to be focusing on essentially what you would consider the classical period of Sparta, what they consider the antiquity period. Is that what it is when they
The
talk about an antiquity?
the Gerard Butler period.
No, that's more recent.
Well, I mean,
And man, does that paint a very specific
yes,
picture
it does.
of just the positives of the Spartan society, I guess. That man over there that makes this whole thing run, he is the lamb to my Euro. He is the Zeus to my Poseidon, and he is the Eurysthenes to my Procles. First two kings of Sparta in the diarchy. That's Professor Adam, ladies and gentlemen.
We are a diopoly or a diarchy.
We are
I
a
think is what
diarchy.
it is. And
We're like that group that used to sing the Two Princes. I can't remember who sang that song. That was the name of the song, right?
I have no idea what Two Princes is.
Before you. Just come on. Come on.
I know.
I can't even remember the words.
But we had to travel all the way to Sparta, and I think that this will be probably the only episode that we get to use the word diarchy. And it was something that I had no idea about Sparta, just with their governmental system and everything like that. You only see what you were talking about with like surface level, this is what's making it to Hollywood, this is going to be badass. But their society was pretty unique.
What's also crazy is the whole concept of the diarchy comes about. It doesn't come out in like an intelligent way where they're like, okay, we need two kings for this. One is going to oversee all this. The other one's going to oversee here because we go to war a lot. One king might be killed. No, it was like, oh, back in our history, this woman had twin boys. And when the father asked which one was born first, she was like, I'm not going to tell you. I'll never tell. And so he's like, fuck, now I got to make them both kings.
And who is that father?
Zeus.
Hercules.
No, Hercules, that's right, because, yes, that's right. It came down
Heracles.
from Zeus, Hercules. The Spartans like to trace their lineage back to the direct bloodline of Hercules. So that's a pretty big feather in your cap.
I would say so.
And there is a lot to unpack from this society. There's
There's a lot to pack, too.
a lot to pack, too. Packing, unpacking, packing, unpacking. Before we get into it, feedback's been fantastic, guys. Rate us 5 stars. Click that follow button. Click that like button. Anything that is a positive button, just fucking click it. Yeah, you guys have the interaction's been fantastic. Getting a lot of good suggestions from you guys, and it's getting the gears turning.
It makes our day. It's nice to just kind of get a little bit of love. I think everybody likes that.
All right, I'm not going to do the This Is Sparta thing. I was going to try it, but it's not happening. But without further ado,
This is historically high.
all right, so the origins of Sparta, much like many of the historical places in Greece, is intrinsically tied to to Greek mythology, to the gods and the heroes and their lineages and everything.
It has to be, because how can you come off as cool in a place where other city-states are represented by gods and goddesses?
Like, yeah, the goddess Athena has blessed our city, and this is where we built her statue. She's like, oh, we just like this because we just like this area because we could farm it. Nothing special about this. So yeah, the origins of Sparta. It starts with essentially. Okay, so to explain where Sparta actually is in relation to the rest of Greece. So Greece in itself is a peninsula that goes out into the Aegean.
It's kind of like two, isn't it? Or is the other side of the peninsula where Athens is connected to? Yeah, it's connected to land behind it.
It is. So and this really plays into why Sparta becomes essentially such this powerhouse. Is you have at the time when you have like the Aegean Sea, which is basically the interior portion of Greece, and has it as it kind of butts up on the other side of it is the Persian Empire. Then if you were to go further west, you would get into the Adriatic and then get over to Italy. So part of Greece is actually separated by the Gulf of Corinth, and it kind of divides through a very, very small inlet. Like I've seen pictures of like the Strait of Corinth. There's pictures where it's just like, oh, here's the water, and then you can actually see the end of the land in the distance. So it's this tiny little spit of land that connects the island or the Peloponnese region to the rest of mainland Greece. So Sparta is kind of this more isolated country. They're protected on a couple different sides by these giant mountain ranges.
City-state.
City-state, or polis.
Is that what they're called?
Polis or city-state. So essentially what a city-state is Greece was just made up of, at one point, like hundreds of these city-states, right?
I think more than that. I think.
And you would have just basically a large city, which would be like the capital of your city-state, and then a bunch of towns around it. The reason they call it a city-state is because it's not all together. They recognize themselves in an autonomous way, whereas in our country, yes, we have states. Those states have capitals, much as this would be, but we're all under one body. Greece was just all these different city-states doing all their own things.
And they, just like anywhere else, they had alliances around them. They had warring factions that were other city-states. And just the way that they kind of come about, and this is where the beauty of myth and Greek mythology comes into everything, as Chris was talking about.
It's mythstory.
Yeah.
Is what it is. It's myth history because it's so intertwined, and some of the information is only available through historical writers that also dip their toes into the mythological stuff, that you get to read it as history, and it just has to be taken as fact because there's nothing else.
All this history that we get is basically from philosophers and then digging things up.
Yeah.
Philosophers were also big fans of Greek mythology too, because it sells. It's going to get eyes on things. So the Achaeans, or the Mycenaeans, which I believe we talked about during the Athens episode, and maybe during the Byzantine episode almost, they were replaced in the area by somebody called the Atridae people, and they sprang from Helen of Troy, the daughter of Zeus, and Menelaus, who was one of the kings in
Laconia.
No, he was in Homer, the epic.
Oh, the Iliad
or the Iliad.
Okay.
Whichever one was the one we did an episode on.
There's the Iliad and the Odyssey. I can't remember.
Yes, it was the Iliad then.
Okay.
But he was the king there. And just as we learned from that episode, even though we don't remember which one of it was, Helen of Troy is the one that is taken away.
She becomes Helen of Troy. She's Helen of Sparta.
Yes.
Initially, and that's what causes the whole thing, is she's absconded with back to Troy by Prince Paris, I believe it is, and then face that launches 1,000 ships, this huge invasion. And that, I think, is also one of the things that kind of spread during the myth, that spread essentially that Greek culture all around the Aegean, because if you're looking at the essentially Greek colonies, Greek states at this time, it's not just over on the peninsula. It's all the way around the Aegean, and even into the Persian Empire, there's these places, what's called in Ionia. And so kind of on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea is this land Ionia that has all of these Greek city-states, but it's also on the continent with no separation from the Persian Empire. And that's going to come into play also later.
Just the beauty behind some of these stories is great. But Helen and Menelaus both took the throne of an area that Chris mentioned called Laconia. It was the Laconian throne. A group called the Dorians, which is what is the term historians use. They were the Heraclidae. I think that's how you say it. Heraclidae.
The Heraclides?
Yeah, that could be it.
Heraclides?
They took possession of the Laconian throne. They founded the city state of Sparta. The reason that they have the Hera in the front of their names is because these were the descendants of Hercules.
Or Heracles.
Heracles, yes. Which were the two sons. And supposedly the story behind how you get to their diarchy is because, and this doesn't make any sense to me because it's the same bloodline, but the two twin boys were named kings as a diarchy, and then there was two separate bloodlines that ran these.
Well, yes, technically it is the same bloodline, but at a certain point that bloodline is going to, as soon as they marry somebody else, it technically becomes a new bloodline because it ceases to be the same blood.
If a female does. These were both male boys.
No, they were. What I'm saying is, yes, those two are of the same bloodline. But as soon as, and they're made kings, but how it branches out to where they have their own bloodlines and houses is because as soon as they mix their blood with their wives, that now becomes an independent bloodline unless those women happen to be sisters. So once that difference in blood happens, it is then genetically a different bloodline.
Aren't they both still Hercules' bloodline, though? We're talking a lot about something that's not true, but... Because, I mean, Hercules' blood, as long as it's male descendants that send everything down through that
Correct.
line.
They come from like we were talking about during Darwin, they come from a common ancestor, but once they... And that's true for everybody, though, that it has a separate bloodline. Like the Roosevelts. There's two different factions of the Roosevelts, and they had a common one at one point.
That's how we got different.
But that's how you
kings
get
in
different last
England,
names
though.
and everything, because sometimes the daughter and so you get bloodlines with different last names, and so they don't sound similar.
So if there was no male heir, that would be where the...
Yeah, or no survival. Yeah, only a daughter, and so the bloodline then they had to wait for her son or something like that.
Well, regardless of us going off on that, Sparta's earliest settlements actually look like they sprang up around 1000 BCE, which was about 200 years before the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. So that would have had to have been a whole lot of things happening in a very little bit of time that probably wasn't correct.
Yeah.
More likely believed there were 4 surrounding villages. They more than likely formed the city-state that had the diarchy that came from just 2 villages that were the 2 most powerful villages that decided to just share the throne.
So this is the textbook explanation. This isn't the
Yeah.
fun one. I like the fun one.
The fun one definitely sounds better. One of the very interesting things that I didn't know about Sparta is, according to myth and legend, the Spartans did not ever, in their prime, have a wall around Sparta because their fighting force was so great that they didn't need a wall to protect them.
It was a combination of that and the fact that they kind of had walls because they were sandwiched between this mountain range called Mount Taygetus and then also Mount Parnon. And they were also on a river. So that's why it got founded in the location that it did, is because Greece doesn't have... It's a very rocky...
Bad for growing. We talked about this.
Yeah, it's bad for growing. So that's why olives are so good, is because they can grow out of really difficult terrain. Well, if you have an area that you discover that's a protected valley, it has a fresh water source, a river coming through it. I think they said it was one of the largest rivers in Greece.
And it was like one of 2 that flows year round.
Yes, and allows like for multiple harvests per year because of the location. That's jackpot. That's survivability for your entire people. Not only that, but then you're also able to take any excess you have and sell it elsewhere. So then you're also having, an incoming type economy.
Well, and also if you have 4 villages surrounding you that you came from, it's kind of like a natural wall to be able to see what's going on around you. But yeah, the place where Sparta pops up is probably one of the most ideal places in Greece, just because that river keeps everything green, and you're in between 2 mountain passes. So there's a good chance that river used to be much larger in there, which leaves a lot more deposits, which makes the land a lot more fertile to be able to grow things. And so in that way, they really did get lucky.
They're also inland.
Yeah.
So like down in the Peloponnese, where Sparta is, they're inland quite a bit on that river. Whereas a lot of other places like Athens kind of stick out like a sore thumb out into the Aegean. Yeah, it's not right on the water, but it's close enough to where you could land forces and get to Athens very easily. Sparta, it's a little bit harder, especially if you're going to have to walk a army across there. You have to try to get through that Strait of Corinth when they can just easily defend that.
Well, Athens also was very good on the Navy side because they were right next to the water.
Yes.
Whereas Sparta seemed to be pretty adept on land because they
with a non-existent navy.
Yeah, they could never build boats. During the 8th and 7th century, Sparta was a fairly lawless place. There was a figure that may or may not have been real. If we're just going with the full Greek version of this, definitely real. His name was Lycurgus. Lycurgus adopted these social and political reforms that helped stabilize the area.
The lawgiver.
Yeah, he paved the way for what they call classic Sparta. Don't think he was a real person. He was definitely probably just a name that was attached to a grouping of ideas that were radical.
Same as Homer.
Yeah,
Like we discussed on Homer, is it just a pseudonym that a bunch of different people have added to over the years? I think that's kind of what it is to become, to come up with essentially the political, economic, and social reforms to basically take this society and then turn it into a military oriented society. All that coming from one person having it be successful is very unlikely.
yeah, especially with the thoughtfulness of serving a purpose to try to turn around a wayward city-state.
Yeah, and then to have one person, because they said he wrote the Spartan Constitution, but to have only one person writing that, it kind of seems like it would have been challenged at some point.
But it all worked out for Sparta. I mean, Lycurgus's social and political reforms completely changed them. Changed them so much that they focused on a group of Western neighbors that were known as the Messenians. They conquered them over a 19-year war and secured them as something that they referred to as helots. We'll kind of get into that as far as how the political standing goes. They were slaves. They were state-owned slaves.
Yeah.
The war was just solidified the Spartan land fighting forces because they were able to overtake this fairly large village right next to them. Early 6th century BCE saw Spartan kings Leon and Aglicius, maybe?
Agosicles.
Shift strategy from conquest to kind of alliance building just because they had a pretty big loss in an Arcadian city named Tega. So instead of forcing their way through like they did on the Messenians and kept them as slaves, once they lost, they're like, well, shit, maybe we just need to start being friends with these people that are around us instead of trying to beat them in war.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, too. So, kind of going over like the social classes in Sparta, I think it provides a little bit of context when we're saying these names of like where these people fall into line within the like social classes.
Yeah.
So, within Sparta, you have what are considered the Spartiate. Now, the Spartiate are the actual citizens, what they consider the Spartan citizens. So there's multiple classes of people, and when they talk about Spartans or Spartan citizens, that only encompasses what turns out to be the smallest percentage of the populace of Sparta. So the Spartiates would have to attend. If you've seen the movie 300, there are certain little key words in there that are actually taken from the schooling of Sparta, what it develops. So the agoge that it kind of discusses at the beginning of that movie, where it's the training for the children or the male children to become a Spartan citizen. And so, were the female Spartans, because they weren't allowed to go through the agoge, but were they also considered citizens?
They weren't technically well, they said they were given citizenship, but as far as like voting power or anything like that went, they didn't have it.
Okay.
They weren't Spartanites though. Some of them were, because contrary to popular belief, or Spartiates.
Yeah.
They did say that some women did end up going through the agoge,
Okay.
but it was very, very rare that would happen.
Yeah. So in order to even get into the agoge or be accepted, you usually had to be able to trace your lineage back to the original inhabitants of Sparta. So you had to have that pedigree. So already, as much as Sparta is going to become this powerhouse due to how it builds its society, it's already long-term hamstringing itself from being able to grow in power and replace its losses, things like that. So if you're able to trace your lineage back, and that includes, you're not considered with your lineage, even if your father was a Spartiate and your mother was not, you weren't a Spartiate.
Yeah, you were impure.
It had to be two Spartiates that were like a mother and a father to go ahead and create this other one. There were a couple other kind of exceptions to go through the agoge, and one of them was foster sons. Basically, these foreign students or basically people in power in foreign countries would sometimes, because the agoge ended up becoming this insanely like popular, effective schooling technique, I guess if you wanted to call it that, would send their like sons there to go through this. So those ones would also be able to go through if they were invited. And then also the son of a helot, which was called a syntrophos, if a Spartiate adopted and paid for them to go through the agoge, they would also, under circumstances, be able to attend that as well.
They were just sponsoring a child, basically.
Yep.
And when you did sponsor a child and they turned out to be a great Spartan, it was looked at as a great pride for you personally.
And the agoge is such a huge deal. It's the cornerstone because it takes up such a chunk of these people's lives. It's kind of the pillar of their society and how they are training their citizens. If you don't pay your agoge fees, which there are fees for this, there's a tribute that you have to actually like pay and everything, you can lose your citizenship.
Yeah.
They can revoke that if you don't pay to keep this thing going. It's pretty much a state-sponsored school is what it is.
Yeah.
But you're just paying your taxes into it.
Well, yeah, I guess that is true. As far as the agoge goes, let's hold off on...
No, I got details. I'm just trying to explain kind of what makes a... Yeah,
once
what
we
makes the class.
penetrate it, we're just going to be in deep.
I don't like what you're saying there.
but before we get to any of those, did you ever hear about the Battle of Champions?
No.
So the Battle of Champions is something that I was absolutely shocked by because you and I have talked about this so many times about sending a champion to war instead of just sending factions against each other.
If you're referring to like when they would come out and two armies were going to face each other and they did like your best fighter versus my best fighter.
Yeah, but this isn't how they did it.
Okay.
So in 546 BCE, there was something called the Battle of Champions between Argos and Sparta. And the idea was going to be to send the two armies at each other and just let them go and just see who won. They decided on a plan of the 300 best Argos against the 300 best Spartans.
This number pops up all the time.
Yeah. And whoever wins this 300-person battle, either side gets to claim victory and gets to claim the spoils of war. So it comes all the way down to 2 Argos fighters and 1 Spartan fighter left on the field. And the 2 guys from Argos are like, well, it's 2-on-1. We're going to beat the shit out of this guy and kill him. Let's just go home. And so they take off. They go back to Argos and claim victory. Well, the 1 Spartan just saw the people that he was fighting against leave the battlefield.
Retreat.
And he was the last one standing on the battlefield.
So he goes back and he's like, hey, we won.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this whole city, or this whole champion thing did not do... I mean, it was just like they had the idea of it, but then they both staked a claim, so they really didn't get any further. Herodotus, a guy that was a philosopher back then, says that the Spartans then actually won a physical war against Argos. Mm-hmm. And after that war, Argos is like, hey, double or nothing on the champions thing. And Sparta's like, no, we already won. We don't want to tempt our fate here. And it was just like the first early signs of this number of 300 that sticks out in so many of these stories that I would say have some truth in them. But the repetition of the number 300 for some of these things is kind of like, okay, well, maybe this was just a myth that you guys punched up a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of what it is. But classical society that we talked about was ruled by something, the dual kings. The dual kings, absolutely huge part of this, just because I think, as you were alluding to earlier, the reason that dual kings were so important is they actually had made a rule that both of the kings couldn't go to war at the same time.
Yeah, there was an instance, I think. Of course, these rules come about because a situation happens in which they then have to make the rule. So, battles happening. I can't be sure if it was with Athens or who it was with. Sometime in their history, both kings were sent out to essentially lead the troops into battle. One of the kings ends up just taking like his section of the people, or the people that were kind of like more loyal to him, and it's like, yeah, I don't want to do this, and leaves, and it ends up leading to a loss. So instead of just having one person out there able to command all of it, if one king just decides to leave, then you've just lost half your troops. So they're like, yeah, we can't do this anymore. One king always has to stay in Sparta, probably under the guise of being like, well, we can't lose both kings.
Exactly, yeah. That to me makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there were they were called ephors There were 5 magistrate judges that were of very old age. Any kind of issues that the kings couldn't handle. The kings were clergymen too. They were very high up they were in the church. They were servants of the church.
Yeah.
The E4s would be the 5 that kind of ruled over any sort of like laws or anything like that were in the city, and as far as like trials go or
Like a
anything
Supreme
like that.
Court. Basically, they're the
Yes.
Supreme Court.
Yeah.
In the movie, the E4s are the creepy old, like, disgusting dudes that are like licking on the oracle and everything. They were actually just supposed to be like Spartan individuals. Really quick, just to kind of explain the last 2 social classes, because we'll probably mention their actual
That's what we
names
were
going
getting
here.
to.
You had what were called the perioikoi.
Yeah.
Perioikoi.
We're getting these things mixed up. We're about to get to them.
Okay, go ahead.
Because we still got to go through...
who were all considered the Spartiates? Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So, beyond that, there was something called the Gerutia. The Gerutia were 28 elders that were over the age of 60 that were elected for life.
How are you finding 28 people over the age of 60, man?
That's what I was wondering. And the fact that I think it becomes the age of 60 because that's when you've officially aged out of being called into military action.
That's true. I saw something as well that they were saying when we talk about kind of the differences between how people were treated, namely like women in Sparta and what rights they had versus other places in Greece. They mentioned the median age of women when they died was like 34, 36. And that Spartan women, because of how they lived their lives, lived longer than that. And the average age for, I think, men was 46 in Greece. And Spartan men, I believe, also exceeded that because of the lifestyle we're going to go ahead and discuss. But still, to find that many people, and I guess if you do lead a life that these guys do live, it's the same thing right now. Like if you're exercising for your entire life, when you get older, you're going to have longevity.
That guy that used to have the juicer, Jack LaLanne, you're just going to be Jack LaLanne for the rest of your life.
And at that point, if you made it through all of the battles that they went through and you make it to 60 and you age out of the military, you've probably got a wealth of experience from what they consider like experience not only in Spartan society, but also in warfare. You're going to be useful in any and every way.
The benefit, too, of being elected for life is that's probably a max of 10 more years if you're 60.
Oh, maybe. Maybe. I think some of those guys are getting carried in.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Finally, we had the Ecclesia, which were an assembly of citizens. And as Chris was just talking about, this assembly of citizens was much like how we do things in other countries where...
Congress. It's Congress?
Yeah, but the loudest people were the ones that got the attention
Rubble, yeah.
of the Gerutia.
This is like the guys standing up in like the togas and like shaking their fists at the other side.
And full citizenship for males required being educated at the Agoge, as Chris was talking about, and we're going to dive 2 knuckles deep in pretty soon. This started at the age of 7 is when they went into the Agoge. Any citizen who couldn't afford the Agoge expenses, like Chris was talking about, would lose their citizenship. So this isn't like you have a right to citizenship. This is, you've passed all of the tests, and as long as you keep filling our coffers, we'll let you keep your citizenship. Below citizens were something called the perioikoi.
Perioikoi. So the Perioikoi. Perioikoi. So perioikoi were essentially the free inhabitant non-citizens of Sparta and Laconia. So Sparta is the city, Laconia is the area of which Sparta is kind of like geographically, and then the Peloponnese is kind of the larger area as a whole.
Well, the perioikoi had, I think, it pretty good because with the lives that we're going to talk about of kind of leisure, non-leisure that Spartiates had, they handled a lot of the commerce. So
yes,
they handled a lot of the sales.
They were the merchant class. They were the merchant, and they were basically the ones running the economy of Sparta. And they also served, you're like, well, why would the Spartans just have, a class under them that wasn't, their workers or anything like that? Well, when we get down to discussing essentially the structure of the military, you did have to have a military reserve, because even at its peak, which was around, I think, 500 BCE, there were only 20,000 to 35,000 Spartan citizens. And you're like, well, that's still a lot of citizens. It is, but when you compare it to a place like Athens that has like 360,000 people who have a much different view of citizenship of what it's required to do, you need somebody to supplement your military force if you're going to war. Yeah, your citizens are also going to fight, but you need someone to call upon, and that's where the perioikoi also served as kind of like their army reserved. And they were basically, like Adam was saying, they're the merchant class. They're the ones that kind of run all the commerce, things like that. So you have the ruling class, which are the Spartiate. You have the working class, not even working class, management,
Yeah.
basically, which are the perioikoi. So now we get to the workers. This is where we get to the helots.
Which are the largest class of people in Sparta.
Uh-huh. So these are, again, the people and the descendants of the people that they took over when they took over the territory. Now, with the helots, that wasn't something that if you were born to a helot family, you were then a helot. You were born into this, for lack of a better word, slave class.
What?
And basically, like, the helots themselves, not considered individual property. So it wasn't in the sense of like slavery within the United States where like that slave is mine or anything. Basically, the government was like, oh yeah, we just have this group that's constantly growing and replenishing itself of workers. And what we're going to do is when you need this worker, you just send us the form, fill out how many people you need, or we'll already have them working the land. And one of the things that kind of, I guess, with the helots was a little bit different is they did allow them to like marry and to raise families. And you're like, oh, well, at least they gave them some. It was so they could raise families and create more helots.
Yeah, this hits home in the South more than...
It does, but here's the kicker. The helots were allowed to keep like 50% of like the fruits of their labors.
Then eventually they were able to buy their freedom, but didn't we kind of do that in some places with slavery here?
There's tons of parallels.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like say it's good in any way, shape, or form. They were also required to travel with the army. You would see these guys serving as essentially like the butlers to the Spartan soldiers, carrying their equipment, stitching wounds, or trying to clean stuff up, cooking for them back at camp. So their main priority was just to fight. And then, like Adam said, eventually later on, some of them could buy their freedom. I think they said like a total of like 6,000 were able to go ahead and earn enough to buy their freedom.
The other thing about the helots that is so important and integral to this whole entire part of Sparta is they work the fields. They work the land. And when you work the land and you have slaves that are working the land for you, the reason that other militaries tend to burn out is because they're off during things like the growing season because they're farmers.
The difference in this is you have professional football players who are paid to play nothing but football and prepare themselves to play football. You then have guys that work a job and then play in a league so they can still play a little bit of football. Any of these other soldiers throughout Greece, for the majority of their forces, are these part-time soldiers. They're the National Guard.
Yeah.
2 weekends a month or whatever it is. So when they go to battle, they're called upon, which means not a lot of uniformity in their training, enough to, defend themselves probably, but and not a lot of consistent training, basically, because they have other jobs that they're working. So when you have basically your necessities in your society being taken care of by two classes. You have the helots that are taking care of all the manual labor. You have the perioikoi who are taking care of all of the administrative stuff. You have time for this agoge that we're talking about. And the agoge, like Adam said, starts at age 7 and goes all the way to the age of 30, where you were immersed in this lifestyle. This isn't like you're going home at the end of the day of school. It's not like an 8-hour-a-day thing. You are in this, as in taking you as a child from 7 and immersing you in this until you are 30 years old.
And even after that, I mean, just the togetherness of this whole entire place. The other benefit of this, the Helots, were they handled all of the household chores for the women.
Yep.
And that freed up the Spartites and the women citizens to focus on two things: fucking and fighting.
Yep.
And that's, I think, two of the biggest things that Sparta is like, whoa, that's what they're known for. These women were very, very tough. There were two ways that if you were buried that you could receive a headstone. And that was either if you died in battle or you died giving birth.
You had to die during a victorious battle.
Oh, was it victorious?
You had to die during a
probably buried you on
victorious
the field
battle,
if you
during a
lost.
battle where you fought for victory, and then, died in childbirth, because that was highly recognized as the lifeblood of the Spartan society. Again, they only allow a certain amount of people to be these Spartiates. And so they had certain laws for women that would ensure essentially that they would be as prepared as possible for like rearing children. Basically, this is one of the earliest instances of eugenics. And the Nazis do tie into this episode, surprisingly enough, because a lot of these Spartan ideals for this ideal society were actually copied and popularized during the Third Reich, and some of them tried to be adopted. So as far as like the things that were different from from the rest of the women in Greece, is these Spartan women, the law forbid marriage until either late teens or early 20s, where the average age throughout Greece was girls were being married away at like 13, 14 years old.
After their first period, when they became a woman.
Exactly. And then trying to go through childbirth when they're young like that. Childbirth was already, the mortality rate wasn't great.
Huge.
As it was. So Sparta looks at this and says, this gives our women, more time to mature. And while they're maturing, they're going to be doing things like exercising and wrestling and taking part in, they were numerate and they were literate. And so they had this idea that if you had these strong Spartan women breeding with these strong Spartan men, it was going to breed you this society of basically fucking super beings.
They won the Olympics in chariot racing.
Yeah.
There was a woman from Sparta that won the chariot races at the Olympics.
But she wasn't allowed to earn a medal because you couldn't compete as a woman.
Their women were very fit, very strong, very outspoken, but in a way to where they couldn't go to war, they couldn't be a part of the government. Like I said, they were allowed to compete in the Olympics, but weren't ever given medals when they would win. The interesting thing about that is they won in chariot races. And we'll talk about it a little bit more kind of when we talk about their military or militia. But they were so good in these chariot races and raising horses, they didn't ever use a cavalry.
Yeah.
Which is so weird to me that they wouldn't if they had a good knowledge and understanding of horses. As Chris was talking about, before we do that, each citizen received an equal portion of land to provide for their living wages. They were broken up into like 9,000 plots or something like that, and then that's where your family would be. And this was after, when you got married, you would have children on this. They would sow the land. You would have your helots that you had to pay the state for to come take care of that. They ate at a place that was called the Sistia, or mess. We'll talk about the mess with the Agogi too. But they always ate together. And it was used as like a social gathering to be able to like spread state propaganda or nationalism.
Yeah, and it was a requirement.
Yeah.
Like even the kings had to have an excuse for not showing up for this like daily meal.
So you're not having dinner at your house. You have to show up.
When you're in the Agogi, you are living in the barracks or you are living outside. You are with your group. And we'll kind of, I know we keep saying that, but when we get into the Agogi, it'll all make sense.
We're right there.
So once you essentially left the Agogi and you were past basically what it was, like Adam was saying, you were basically given, they had all these plots of land that were already being farmed and already being used, and then you would just get that and you would already have helots out there that were working for you. So they constantly had this system of just being like, hey, we're going to enrich everybody. But then what that does is that instantly allows you to run that land and then in turn right around to start paying your dues or doing your contribution to the Sisti and the Agogi.
Well, yeah, just like you were talking about paying your contribution, the food that was served in these messes was just literally food that was coming off of these plots of land.
Yeah, so okay, the agoge, I don't know if we're painting this in the right picture.
We're like 2 minutes away
No,
from
no, no,
getting
I
to
know
the
we
full
are.
thing.
But what I'm saying is the agoge is a school only in the sense of what that it's trying to teach. If you're a male in Sparta from age 7, you are basically sent away from your family with all the other boys age 7 to 30 in your city, and you are just immersed in this lifestyle. And so there's no going home. There's no really going to see your family. There's nothing like that. You are just doing that. And so once you get done with that, they need you to start pumping stuff back in, which is why you get that land. Because you're not coming, you haven't had time to build a life for yourself. Just getting out of the Agoge and being approved essentially as a Spartiate, that earns you that. And then they're like, but you're going to be sending this stuff back to us.
It's like you haven't built up enough credit to get a credit card once
Yeah.
you become of age.
Yeah.
But to get to that agoge, you have to be 7 years old. And for a child in Sparta to make it to 7 years old, it was not the easiest road to hoe. Because when a baby would be born, there would be a group of elders in these villages that would then come visit the baby, and they would put it through some sort of a testing process to see if the baby was, for lack of a better term, spry. Like, one of the things that they would do would be they would dunk them in wine, and as they sat in the wine, if they were trying to splash around and get out and there was movement,
And thrashing and everything, they were like, oh, it's got some fight in it.
yeah.
Yeah.
They would also check the limbs for any sort of lameness to make sure 10 fingers, 10 toes, but that all the limbs were working fine. So if you passed that, you got to live to the age of 5, where there would be a second set of testing to make sure that you were good to continue on. When I say good to continue on, the ones that weren't good to continue on were victims of infanticide. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, and this is not anything new within the ancient world. This kind of took place everywhere where if villages, small, communities are trying to just fight, survival.
Yeah.
If you don't have someone that can contribute, there's a knowledge, and a thought that like, okay, well, this person can't contribute, so it's going to be a drain on us. So as shitty and as disgusting as it is, this was nothing new. They said, that scene in 300, like he would have been discarded. It shows the big pit full of all the baby bones and all that kind of stuff. They haven't ever found archaeological evidence of that. They have found, and they said that this took place up on Mount Taygetos is where this would happen. They've done archaeological digs, and they've found pits where there have been like bones, like up to 45 different, skeletons, but they're adults.
Yep.
So they figured it must have been maybe like just where they dumped the criminals. But who knows? It's a fucking mountain range.
Yeah.
There could be places that, and you're having to pick a needle in a haystack to dig, so there could have been a different spot where they dumped the kids.
They also said more likely was they would just leave them on the side of the hill and then nature would take its course.
Yes, yeah, more so.
I mean, it's shocking, it's sad, it's gross, but this is why this was the ancient times and we are where we are now.
Yeah.
Because we've learned to be able to support these people because we've been afforded a way of life to be able to have the ability to do that. And they didn't. So if you made it past infancy, if you made it to the age of 5, as soon as you turned 7 years old and you were of Spartan citizenship, or you had, like you were talking about, essentially a sponsor, you would be sent to the agoge. The agoge, I believe, is just the Greek word for school.
Yes.
So it's nothing like a super special name. I think it had something else that was
It was
special.
like called the Spartan Agogian because it had the Spartan in front of it. That's why it was so special.
But as Chris was alluding to, this was the school. And it was the school of the school because it produced kids that turned into very adept and good soldiers, also good leaders. The earlier years, they said that there would be some comings and goings to like school and family. And they said mostly it was so the parents could teach them like reading and writing and the shit that they weren't learning at the school. Because at the school, it was nothing but hands-on learning, exercise, strength building, and
Torture.
just kind of like mind building for
Torture.
these kids.
Any torture in there?
That's mind building, I think,
Yeah,
or
okay.
mind breaking down.
So, are we full on into the Agogi now?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
So the Agogi, the structure in which it, comprised it. So you had 3 different age ranges. You had what are the Pades, which are 7 to 12 years old. You had the Pades Koi, which are 12 to 20 years old, and then you had the Hebantes, which are 20 to 30-year-olds. So during your time, again, you're living almost in the barracks and living out in the open. And when I say out in the open, I mean like next to the fucking river. Like, it was all about teaching these kids to be the toughest they could be for survival. Food, sleep, shelter deprived. Violence was encouraged for survival in these groups. So again, in the movie when they're making the kids fight, there was some truth to that. Like, that's how they were essentially building these men.
What about clothing?
Well, that depends on what age range that you were in. I'm getting to that. And then, yeah, restricted from contact with birth families, and then eventually wives once you were able to be of an age to marry.
One of the really cool things about that early section that you were talking about, the first one, the 7 to 12,
The potties.
the potties, there's
Potties, Padawan. Ooh, do you think they got that from...
potentially,
Ooh.
they weren't ever trained with weapons. They were trained in more of a hand-to-hand combat type environment
Yeah.
because it's kind of like the baseline learning of being a good soldier. It's the thing that you always want to learn in the beginning, because that way when everything else breaks down and that's all you have left, it's just like riding a bike.
I also think it was because having a 5-year-old myself, I can't imagine what 7's going to be like. 7-year-olds probably aren't in real control of their emotions, so if you give a 7-year-old any type of weapon, even like a wooden stick, they probably aren't. You're probably going to have a little more casualties than you want in those early years.
It's a good point. Didn't think about that.
But they were also foundational years. Like you're saying, you're trying to build a foundation for skills they're going to be able to use throughout the rest of the Agogi. So you learn the basics of reading and writing, running, wrestling. You also did choral dance performances. So Spartans, they love to dance. Love to fucking dance. And so dancing and singing, these were also things that tied into worship of the gods during these festivals that they had, that they would be, listen, you have nothing but free time. You're learning to fight and all that shit. You got to mix in something different.
Yeah, you do need to put something else in the rotation. And by all accounts, they said that the Spartans were all pretty pious.
Yeah.
They were pretty religious, and in celebrating these gods as well, they are just kind of, I don't know, trying to bring themselves closer to maybe some luck.
So as you're kind of living in the system of the Agogi, you're also kind of in these like packs, and starting, like stealing is actually encouraged. Mm-hmm. Getting caught stealing, that's what gets your ass beat. You're trying to steal without getting caught, and what you're basically trying to do is build yourself up to prove your worth, or to make yourself, worthwhile, to build a skill set. Starting at 12, this is what you were talking about. They're giving one clothing item a year, and it's a cloak. It's a cloak that you got to wear in the summer, which it gets hot as shit in Greece. That's one thing that makes the Grecian topography so crazy, is that you get 4 months of the year where it apparently just rains the fuck out of it. And so it creates all these, landslides that come through and wash out all these areas. And then in the summer, it gets blistering hot where the land cracks and the landscape dries out. So it's the landscape is harsh.
Well, they're in an area between 2 mountain ranges, which means there's always a chance for snow.
That's true.
You said that they were given one piece of clothing. That means that they were never given shoes.
Yes, they were also made to train barefoot because it would work on their agility and toughen up their feet for battle. They're doing everything here.
Yeah. There were, excuse me, points in time. I don't remember if it was during the second time frame, but where they were actually like taken out into the public square and whipped. And when they were whipped, the goal of doing that was to have them not show any emotion on their face.
Yep.
to just basically mentally break them down to the point to where pain is just, it doesn't register. So just, it's such mental training that it's almost scary. Like, they are just literally trying to turn these people into soldiers, but they're preparing them for a life of sort of like just leisure and staying in shape. And then eventually you'll go to war sometime.
That's what it is. It's if when we go to war, we're going to war to win with the best troops that are possible to have. So during that time frame when they're in that 7 to 12 range, they're actually kind of put into these groups. I'm trying to find the name of it. I know I wrote it down somewhere.
I thought they were called packs. Oh, that would go out and...
Yeah, there's a certain term for it, but it was basically packs is what it was. And they were divided up, and they were usually led by like an older boy and would have been chosen by the younger boys themselves on who was going to kind of lead the pack. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. Oh, it's Aglai, meaning pack, basically. And so you had these packs, and that's why stealing was encouraged, as you were trying to contribute to your pack. So once we get past that, also during that age range, have you ever heard the term laconism? It's like a witty saying, like short, witty phrases. Apparently it's a used term, but they were taught to speak in a way that they were taught to use short, witty phrases. They were almost taught to shit talk. It was their version of like shit talking because it built up camaraderie. It built up humor in between comrades and everything. So they were taught to use this specific type of speaking that's called laconism.
Weren't they also like the kings of shorthand?
That's what it was. It's short, witty phrases.
But like in battle, so they could control the troops easier.
I would imagine
by
that's
saying
probably
less words.
I imagine training them young for this would have built that in their head to be able to communicate in a economy of words.
Like a short, concise. This is what.
Yes,
needs to
like if
happen.
you need to give a report on something, you're just providing just the details. You're able to do it succinctly. So, around the age of 12, also, you would enter into a relationship with one of the young adult Spartans, probably one of the 20 to 30-year-olds, and I mean, I'm assuming that people can imagine what would go on in these relationships. It's ancient Greece. Here's the thing. We danced around this before we started recording on kind of how this would be presented, and here's just the facts. You are taking boys who are 7 years old, and you are putting them in nothing but an environment where there are other boys. You're constantly sleeping in the same place, eating together, you're creating friendships, you're creating trust, relationships, and you start to get to the point where your hormones are starting to develop. And as it's already kind of an accepted part of your culture, there really aren't any qualms about these relationships. It was essentially supposed to be a form of relationship where these older Spartans still within the agoge would be almost mentoring these younger boys. But yeah, there was definitely a sexual aspect to it as well. What did you say the terms were?
It was
the inspired.
The inspirer was the old, kind of sage but still young supple boy,
and then the Hera was the young boy that they would have. So after moving into that next age group, you have the pediskoi, and this is where essentially they would transition and begin integration, like training for like integration into an adult society. So teaching them additional skills. This is when the loyalty also shifts from the pack that you have and were assigned to living with and surviving with to the, what was the name for the mess? The Sistia. Yeah, the Sistia. So this is when you would also be focusing on that. You would start eating together in these large groups with people now that were, with the Sistia, Spartans of all age ranges and of all statuses, but all citizens. So you're already being surrounded by all of these people that have gone through what you're going through as well. Of course, physical training continues and gets a lot more intense. So this is kind of, they say was the transitional period between childhood and adulthood.
And not to leave the underlying homosexuality element out there, it's just what these guys did. Some of them were gay, some of them weren't. They engaged in intercourse together. I'm probably going to laugh when we talk about that. It's not a laugh out of hate. It's just a laugh out of thinking that the most prime fighting force in Greek culture and the Spartans, the much celebrated Spartans,
Did just as much gay shit as the rest of Greece did.
yep, they just banged each other.
Yep.
And I mean, it's an incredible thought to have, but at the same time, this just wasn't weird. It wasn't stigmatized ever as being anything that was against the rules, really.
What do you, like, from a biological standpoint, just from feeling those hormones and those urges and everything, what's more likely that you're going to be able to suppress those urges between the ages of 7 to 30, or that you're going to be looking at your buddy and being like, we both got these urges, maybe we can help each other out,
And we're
just
both
give
in
into them?
great shape.
Yes,
We're both just building our bodies.
just rock hard during these wrestling matches, just fully torqued.
I can't say that I get it, but this was just a way of life.
Yeah.
And just like any way of life, sometimes they can be pretty funny.
Yeah.
And along with Chris talking about these cystias, you were, until the age of 30, whether you were married or not, you were to live in these dormitories with everybody that had been in your pack since you were 7 years old when you were first put into these things. I imagine they were finally combined and got a little bit
You
bigger.
do not have a life. The agogi is your life from 7 to 30.
And just the whole idea behind being married and trying to like sneak away and start a family maybe a little bit early, but every night you have to be back in this bunkhouse essentially with all these other dudes. I mean, it's got to be a tough situation. And the marriage was a little interesting, and I'm glad that I kind of cleared up the thoughts of homosexuality before, because the hairstyling of the day, first off, Leonidas, I think, kind of lies to us about the hairstyling of the day in 300 and a lot of their just look as far as the 300 goes. And it makes total sense to me because the Spartans were told and kind of encouraged that growing your hair long and growing your beard long were both things that you wanted to do.
Yep.
Part of it is so obvious to me because being able to shave with a razor that would be sharp enough that it wouldn't just mangle your face and get that hair off wasn't easy.
Well, they had to do their mustaches, and it was probably like, this is fucking murder. I'm not doing the whole beard, and I'm not doing my fucking head. So I'm just growing, because mustaches were a weird thing that weren't really prevalent, but beards and long hair. Also, if you see a bunch of like dudes wearing their helmets and you see their hair flowing out from under it, it was supposed to almost make them look crazed.
Yeah.
Crazed in battle. So it was supposed to be kind of like a psychological type move as well. Before we get any further into this, let's take a bathroom break.
Okay.
Oh my God, Adam. What is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials! Oh my God. It's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X?
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
Able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to historically high pod on Threads.
And, I mean, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historically high podcast at gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show. All right, so getting back to what you were talking about regarding the marriage, because we need to dig into this. So in order to be married, you had to be within that third range of the agoge. You had to be one of the hebontes. That was age 20 up to 30. So at that point, you could be chosen to lead one of the agele, one of the smaller, like 7 to 12-year-old groups. You were eligible for military service. So if there was war, you would actually be fighting. So you had your skills at that point enough to participate in military campaigns. They weren't considered full adults, though, at that point, because they were still going through the agoge. You could be possibly selected for the Crypteia. Did you read about the Crypteia? So
Was it the special forces?
The secret police.
Yeah, okay.
So basically, and as soon as I saw them refer to that, I was like, fuck. I'm like, is this where we get like the fucking Gestapo? Because the stuff about the Crypteia that they were talking about is there would be these certain initiations that you would have to go through. The Crypteia, the secret police, were the ones that were in charge of policing the Helots. And so there were some historians that were saying part of that initiation was to go out and kill a Helot or find the biggest helot you could and kill them as part of like your initiation for the secret police.
It seems like a bad move killing the biggest, baddest one, though, right?
Yeah,
Just
it
for
does.
reproductive
But
purposes.
maybe that's to send a message like we can do. We're not going to kill your weakest one. We're going to kill the one that you would use to fight us with.
The one you guys look up to.
Yeah, exactly. And then 300, again, here's this number again. So 300 of these guys would be chosen for these things called hippies. And basically, it was 3 groups of 100. And so you would be basically creating these teams. You'd be creating rivalries. You were supposed to sabotage the other teams if you could. If you saw them violating any of the rules or the laws of Spartan society, you were encouraged to go ahead and report them. So it was basically like it separates them into these packs when they're young. Then it brings them together. Then it separates them again. I don't know if the idea of that is to make sure that they can also operate independently within smaller, like I'm not sure of what that is, or if it's just to foster that competition regardless, because that's what it was. It was basically a 100 v 100 v 100 competition.
I think it's both of those, and then added to this just shows the power that we have over these guys, that we can send them out as a team at one point and then tell them to turn on each other at another point.
Make sure that the ones that were in the packs together are on the different teams and everything, and just be like, your loyalty is not to an individual. Your loyalty is to Sparta.
Yeah. And you're our family now. Or we're your family. So it's, I mean, to me, it's sort of, I don't know. It was just a complete power structure, I think, and it did pay off really, really well, because part of the reason they were so good on the battlefield is because they were able to take directions so well from people that were very good at giving directions. And the fact that they had this time in
You were programmed.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Everyone had the same programming. You were operating as just one. I mean, it's what militaries do now, man. Like you operating under one directive, one style of training to make sure that you can be plugged in anywhere and everywhere and still be a cohesive, effective fighting force. So the fact that this doesn't sound revolutionary, because most modern militaries, or all modern militaries, do this, but at the time when you have almost every other city, state, or every other country or civilization not really having these huge standing armies or people that are professional soldiers, but at the same time being like statesmen and everything, because they were still having to make the laws and the rules and all of that stuff. It's a very, very unique structure in a society, but it's almost itself is its undoing when it eventually does end, because of the limitations that it puts in its, I guess, qualifications to participate.
Well, and at one point in time, it was up against democracy.
Yeah.
So their system of doing things, which I don't know how we got to, because we were supposed to be talking about marriage.
I'll get to marriage in just a second. I just want to finish this out, because this is what I want to explain what you had to do to be able to even get to that point.
Okay.
So at age 30, upon graduation of the Agoge, you would be allowed to have a family. You would be provided the land that also had the helots to be working it. And you had to be accepted into the Sistian. And the Sistian is essentially that mess that we've been talking about, and where your contribution to, your food, grain, all that stuff, that was your dues. That was your contribution to make sure all of Spartan society was fed and all of the Agoge was fed. That's what everyone is doing with these contributions. Did you hear the selection process and how they went through if one of these guys could get into the Sistia or Sistian?
There were different ones, weren't there? They were like social clubs.
Yes.
But there were multiple different, and not necessarily like a Skull and Bones or like a Stonecutters. One of those was the Simpsons.
Yeah.
But like secret societies, they were all pretty well known, and it was maybe almost sort of like English soccer fans.
Kind of.
A little bit.
So what you would have to do is, when this person came in that was trying to essentially, they graduated the Agoge, they were trying to be like an initiator, join your Sistian, they would have a bowl and they would hold it on their head, and everyone would be given a piece of bread, and they would roll it into a ball.
You're kidding me, right?
Nope. And the person would walk around with the bowl on their head, and the people would drop in, all of them, and they would all have every one of them voted.
Oh, it was a vote. I thought you meant
No.
like they would throw them
Nope.
and the guy would try to catch them with the bowl.
If one person, and how they voted in a negative is they took the ball and smashed it flat like a disc. If they found one of those, you did not get into that Sistian. There were people, depending on how you grew up, performed, made connections all throughout the Agogi and showed what your character was, you may have pissed off one person, and that person has a vendetta against you, and all of a sudden they're the vote that, and that's the last one that you could become a part of, because if you're not part of this, you do not get your citizenship.
It is so much social equity. I wonder if there was like people that were starting them that just took everybody. Because to me, when I hear this, what you're explaining is almost no different than Greek life and fraternities.
Yeah.
That's they have rush week. I'm sure there was plenty of torture. They were probably like shoving rocks in these guys' asses to see how many they could fit, see maybe how big their mentor was. But they were definitely hazing them a little bit. And then in the end, I think how fraternities work is all the senior brothers or whatever the board is votes on if you get in or not. And I base that pretty much just on movies that I've seen.
So they said, depending on the period in which you're talking about, for number of those Sistias, were around like 50 of them, or sorry, not 50, 15 of around 200 or 400 members. So that was kind of during the time of like peak Sparta, I guess. And so, yeah, you had 200 to 400 in these 15 different like social clubs or like clubs you were supposed to be able to join. But fuck, can you imagine getting down to like the 13th or the 14th and you're like still haven't joined one yet? And you're like, I have been in this system for the last 23 years. And now all of this, I'm so close to all of this being for nothing if I don't get accepted into one of these. That had to have been fucking nuts.
And then if you just don't get accepted, you start lambda, lambda, lambda. Is that?
Oh, no, I don't think so.
You don't
I don't think
you
that
get
was
to
an
start
option.
your own?
I don't know if you would join the other class.
The Piochioi or whatever they
Yeah,
were?
the merchant class, or if you would do anything like that.
I'm sure they would just take your citizenship.
You wouldn't gain it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just wouldn't gain your full citizenship. But going back to one of the things that you would gain if you did get accepted into one of these Sissians, you would be able to marry. And the marriage portion of that, you could get married anywhere within that 20 to 30 range, I think, but you wouldn't be able to live with and start a family with your wife. So I'm trying to map out in my head how the courting process worked for this, because these guys are supposed to be at the Agogi at all times and not be having this contact. So you have people, and obviously they knew about it because there were these marriages happening. Was part of you going and sneaking out and trying to get a girlfriend and a wife, like one of the things about stealing, like, we better not fucking catch you doing this, so you better be good at not getting caught.
I'm sure. I mean, a lot of them I heard and read back in the day were arranged marriages.
Okay.
So that was probably already made for you.
Standard procedure of the time.
But you sort of had, it wasn't frowned upon. It was frowned upon that a woman wouldn't be a virgin going into a marriage. But it wasn't like so frowned upon that we're going to throw you off a cliff or anything like that.
Yeah.
We can work around this.
Yeah.
So you kind of had three choices as a man to lose your virginity or to get out your urges. And it would either be one of your other mates in the pack, which I'm sure push came to shove. That happened plenty of times.
Push and shove. Yeah.
You have, if you're out in public and you happen to fancy one of these women that aren't married yet or sometimes even married, you had a romp, that would happen. Or it would be dipping down into a hellet and taking care of business that way. But those were your outlets. You were told not to do it, but just like you were talking about, there's a sneak factor in this whole teaching process that allows you to do it.
And your whole goal, too, is eventually you're wanting to get your line progressed and how much you're able to contribute not only to Spartan society from a supplier, like, you know, your not tithe. Tithe is I don't know why that word comes. It is kind of a tithe.
Yeah.
But what you're contributing, but also if you can contribute more boys that
Physical
are
tithe.
that are considered Spartiates or available to go through the Yogogi, like if you can imagine the guy that like pumped out like 7 sons.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone's just like, this guy's fucking animal.
They've actually, one of the things that they would talk about, that the historian was talking about, was if you had like 3 or more children, you would be looked at like in a loving way from the government. If you had 5 or more children, it would open up like more opportunities to you politically and socially, just because you were producing mostly males that you were sending to the Agoge. I'm sure a lot of that was probably the more kids you had in the Agoge, the more that you had to pay the Agoge. Like, they
Yeah.
probably didn't cut you a deal.
Yeah.
Like, if there's 3 kids in there, you only got to pay for 2. But if you were contributing to that warrior class, you were looked at in high regard because, A, you were fertile, B, you had found yourself a very fit, in shape woman, or C, you were just lucky. And there were situations where in relationships, monogamy was something that they practiced in marriage. But as far
Yes.
as like having children, if you were just a sterile man that couldn't produce children, you were able to choose a champion of sorts.
A stud.
A stud, yes.
Yeah.
Of your friends to come in and take a crack at your wife.
So this was considered, this was a wife sharing. So this was not uncommon. Sometimes you would have older men that were, in their 50s and unable to produce, but they would also have younger wives that were maybe in their 20s or 30s. So they would basically just go down to the Agoge or down to the guys that had just maybe like graduated that weren't married yet. And it's just like, okay, who looks the most jacked?
Yep.
Who's got the best test scores, and who do I want to impregnate my wife? And you would have circumstances where there was a man that didn't have a wife, but he wanted to go ahead and contribute and make children. So he would have his married buddy's wife, if they were done having kids and taking care, because again, he would be responsible for those children, with his citizenship
Yeah.
and everything. But part of the contribution would be for her to be like, okay, I guess I'll have your kids. So when it came to the procreation and population expansion of the Spartans, monogamy wasn't really a thing that it was a requirement.
In practice, but in practicality, well, I guess that's
If
the
it
same
wasn't
thing.
for the reason of procreation and like it probably would, it was frowned upon.
Yeah. So you had just all these different weird relationships that were going on, but this was all in the goal of filling the Agoge with the most males possible, from men and women that were both very much in shape, were very much able to defend themselves, that were very smart. They were just, it was this genetic breeding that you were talking about, trying to create the best kids. When you have soldiers that have been in a situation for so long where they're pretty much just only around boys and men, when it comes time for marriage, there may have been a little issue in the transition period.
Mm-hmm. A little shock. A shock to the system.
You want to talk about the...
Oh, no, you've been waiting for this. Go right ahead.
The way that females carried themselves and dressed themselves was more unique. There were stories about the great beauty of the Trojan women.
Spartan
women. Helen of Troy was literally Helen of Sparta beforehand, and she was supposed to be one of the most beautiful women in history.
Well, here's the thing too. You have not only in like the way that they carried themselves or the way that they grew up, but they also dressed like much, more appealing than other women in Greece. So where you would have like women in Greece and it's hot as fuck, having like full like dresses and gowns and everything. Spartan women would have, these gowns that were slit all the way up their thighs to where they could ride horses or they could engage in some type of physical activity and have flexibility. So, God, you're just walking around, you're jacked as hell, and you know that every woman in your village has also been required to like exercise and get in like the best shape possible from a food perspective as well when they were like distributing food as part of that. The girls ate just the same stuff that the boys did. It wasn't like they were cutting anything back. Like they were having them also eat the same type of stuff.
We did forget to mention in Sparta that if you got too far out of shape, they could take your citizenship as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that was a literal requirement. If you got fat, you just wouldn't be able to be a member of society anymore.
Well, and they also like in like Athens and everything, daughters were confined to their homes. They weren't confined to their homes in Sparta. Girls were actually encouraged to go out and exercise and compete with each other and wrestle and compete with boys for kind of that kind of stuff. So although you do have a female populace that is probably much closer to what you're used to, but at the same time, there are anatomical parts that exist on a woman that you have not seen or been accustomed to, and that might not be your bag at that point in your life because your bag has been an actual bag with a shaft on top of it. And so in order to ease the transition, once the marriage proposal had been accepted and everything like that, for the wedding, the woman's hair would be cut short. So woman's hair would be cut short. She would be dressed in more masculine clothes, correct?
Yep.
And then the process in which the consummation of the marriage, as you know, today it's, you know, you get a hotel room, you put on some, you know, light some candles, put down
You carry her across the threshold.
You carry her across the threshold. What did they do in Sparta?
It was a little bit of a fight. It was a little bit more of a wrestling match, more of a maybe we shouldn't be doing this on one aspect of it, but part of that scaredness is the fun. This to me is like a baseball player that can hit the fastball, but he has trouble with the curve, and the curve is just the vagina.
Okay.
And so he just keeps pounding the fastball until he can finally figure out, like until he's comfortable with an off-speed pitch.
Well, and this was supposed to be the time, of course, consummating the marriage, and you had to make sure that happened in order to legitify the marriage. I'm not trying to be graphic about this, but what I envision this as you're grown up in a society where the sex has not been a lot of front-facing sex.
No,
You've been
probably
staring
not.
at a lot of the back of somebody's heads and or the back of somebody's head. So, in the situation in which you are, and there was probably some fighting that went along with it and
a lot of
everything.
fighting.
You didn't want to be the guy that was just like, I'm giving it up for nothing. I at least fight back a little bit to begin with. It made it more sporting. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the way in which it was supposed to be consummated wasn't like, hey, we're going back to my place or yours. You would be encouraged to try to like capture her or kidnap her and take her to like a public place, or not public, but like almost like get her down an alley or take her into like a back room and almost like force sex upon her. Am I
Yeah, you know, you're doing a great job.
Okay.
You're trying to get him in neutral territory.
Yes, you're trying to get them in that position, and then I would imagine that the sex would be from a behind or doggy position.
Yeah, probably.
Because that is what you're used to. That's what gets your dick hard at this point. And once you get used to the more feminine features, then if, you know, that occurred and you were just like, oh, I like this now, that's how it was, and you just adapted to that. But because they needed to ensure that you were gonna be able to do that in that instance, they were like, okay, we got to try to put some.
We're gonna put you in a halfway house.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it was. Yeah, you're not ready for society yet. We're gonna get you there.
I don't know if we've harped on this too much, but it's pretty interesting. It's pretty funny.
But if you just think about it from a rational
logical.
standpoint, it's super, super logical.
Yeah, and that's something that we didn't really tee off with and start off with, but the history that we get from.
I don't know if I should say this.
Say it.
I'm saying it. How many instances in which the husband and the wife, they get together, they're getting down to it, and she's like, nope, there's a different one. It'll be fine. You'll like it. And has to then redirect because listen, if you're Steph Curry, you've got the 3-point down.
Yeah.
You've been shooting nothing but threes. Someone wants you to shoot a different kind of shot that you're not used to shooting. You might try to shoot the three. You're shooting from that range. So I would imagine that there were a lot of like, it's a little bit different. Can you say that in a deeper, a little bit different?
Good enough.
Yeah.
Good enough. I'll take it. the history that we get from Sparta isn't Spartan history because the Spartans rarely wrote anything down. So most of the sources that we have to go on a lot of this stuff that isn't just like archaeological findings is Greek poets that or Greek philosophers that lived hundreds of years potentially after Sparta
It's
had
a lot of Herodotus. A
lost
lot
its
of
luster.
Herodotus.
Yeah. And it's also not from a Spartan point of view.
I think
So
we kind of touched on that where do you think that's because they were like, these are like state secrets?
yeah.
Like this is the Bush's baked beans family recipe. This is Colonel Sanders' Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. We make the magic here. We don't want any of this getting out to anyone else and them being able to challenge this.
It's there's a great shot at that. The downside to that though is if you don't always come out on top and your oral history isn't continued because maybe you lose or there's a change in society and culture, everybody else from Athens that you constantly fought with, everybody else from Argus, anything like that, they're going to be the ones that write your history. And when they find out that maybe you cut your wife's hair short to get married or some of the other things that go on, they're probably going to be pointing out the more odd things in society that you do.
Yeah.
So there's a chance that maybe this stuff was a little bit more normalized and some of these stories are getting punched up just to make the Spartans look really different. But at the same time, none of this is far enough away from like how other places in Greece did things for me to be like, no, they're piling on now.
Here's the other thing too, man. It could be just simply the fact that like I'm not saying that, okay, if you, I don't know why I'm fixated on this, but if you're just used to banging dudes, which there's nothing wrong with that, bang away. Bang anyone that makes you happy. What I'm saying, though, is if you are just doing that for the longest time, and then you could love this girl because you courted her and everything like that, you could think she's beautiful, but then you go to do something that you've been doing for a long time and it's different, the nervousness, the mind fuck of that and everything, you could want to do it, but physically your dick is like, I'm not sure what to do here. Like it was whatever. They obviously had something that happened previously, and they were like, we can fix this by maybe just giving her a buzz cut. Like we noticed that once we started giving these girls buzz cuts, the consummation rates went through the roof.
Something changed. Are we back
So that
into...
kind of explains Spartan society. So now I
Yeah.
think we can kind of get into essentially the timeline for history, and it'll make a lot more sense with the context of how everything operates there.
Yeah, we focused on some different things about history that I didn't really expect coming into this, but I think we nailed them down pretty good. I think that might be the end of sodomy
and
talk.
Gomorrah? Like Sodom and Gomorrah? Sodomy?
Sodomy talk, yeah.
Okay.
We might jump back into some BF.
I mean, we're going to get into some battles where they
Yeah.
sodomize some other armies, but
Good point. 490 BCE, as you'll know, there's going to be some overlap here from the Athenian episode, just because they work together sometimes.
and we talked about the Peloponnesian War, so that was
Yeah.
this was the two main adversaries fighting for essentially Greece. You had the Athenians who, democracy, all of that kind of stuff, philosophy, big navy, and then you had the antithesis to that with the diarchy and basically in Sparta. So they're going to naturally butt heads.
Well, the reason that it's called the Peloponnesian War is because the Athenians wrote about it, and if you're going to name a war after somebody that you didn't like, it was their fault when
I
you
think
called it the
that
Peloponnesian
historian
League.
made that point. He's like, I refer to it as the Athenian Peloponnesian War
Yeah.
because it discussed both parties.
Both sides were in there. 490 BCE, Spartan troops reinforced Athens at the Battle of Marathon, but as soon as they showed up, the Athenians just told them, nah, we don't need you guys in this. We can go ahead and repel the Persians ourselves. And there was a little bit of tension there where it's like, okay, well, we want to help. But at the same time, if we're ever making a move to try to help you, we're immediately putting ourselves in danger. Because just like we talked about before with the Helots being the largest population inside of Sparta, if you ever overextend yourself in war and you don't have enough people to quell a rebellion of these Helots back home, your soldiers, even if they win, they won't have anything to return to.
They're fighting literally a war on two fronts. They're constantly fighting a war at home, and then whatever they choose to do outside of Sparta, that's their second front. When you only have this secret police and everything that are like policing these guys, you do have soldiers at home, but if you take a majority of the army out, you end up losing a good percentage of them. You come back with less people to enforce subjugation of the Helots. There were revolts that happened, and they were able to put them down, but at what point was it going to get to the discrepancy of we don't have enough Spartans to put down the next one? So they had to be very particular. Think of it this way. The investment in each of these Spartan citizens is so huge that when you lose, you lose an Athenian troop. You lost a baker. His son's a baker.
Yeah.
He'll start baking and then come in and fight part-time as well. We didn't lose a huge investment in that guy. Yeah, we trained him a little bit every now and then. The Spartans, you just lost a 23-year investment, if they're just graduating, even more so if they're older, of training and everything that we put through. So what am I trying to say?
Well, also, if you lose a Spartan soldier, you just lost a potential 3 nuts that he was going to pop that puts 3 more kids in the agoge that then continues to grow. So you lose.
Yes, you're losing breeding stock. You're losing your top breeding stock.
Yeah.
In a lot of these battles as well, when they would actually, Sparta would march into battle, they would have the red cloaks, they would have the bronze shields, and they would all be in the same uniform. So you could sometimes get 30,000, Spartans all looking the same, but you might only have 5,000 Spartiates in that group, and the rest of them are from that perioikoi class that are their army reserve, because again, they need to field 30,000 people, but they can't take that many Spartiates out of Sparta, or else the Helots could revolt. You could lose too much of your breeding stock. So they're having to play this balancing act of being able to field an army and field enough of the guys that are professional fighters to win, but also not risk too many of them that if they end up losing a portion of them, it completely throws their society into chaos.
And you still need the backup because you need a presence on the battlefield.
Exactly. So the Battle of Marathon that Adam was talking about, that was during the Persians' first attempted invasion of Greece. That was done by, I think, Darius, was Xerxes' dad's name. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the Athenians end up... And here's the thing, too. Technically, this was an Athenian war, because Athens, during this point, I think, had gone over and convinced some of the other... country or some of the other city-states so you had the Peloponnesian League, and then what was the other side?
Delian League.
The Delian League. But it was also Ionia that was also part of that, all those lands on the west side, the east side of the Aegean. They started some shit with Persia, where they had one of the cities there that was kind of a Persian but Greek city-state, end up revolting against Persia, and had a bunch of these other city-states on that side revolt and was providing aid and everything. So that's why Darius ended up coming over. He's like, okay, Athens, you're fucking up because you're trying to overthrow us in this area, so we're going to come take the fight to you. And because that would have been an invasion of Greece itself, and what's going to happen if Sparta establishes a toehold that close to the Peloponnesian region? Mm-hmm. It's going to be a lot easier for them to march across and have a launching point to conquer. Why would they just be satisfied with just Attica, where Athens was? They also had Macedonia, didn't they, at this point? That was higher up to the north. But it was far enough away where it wasn't like a super immediate threat. It was far enough away from the Persian Empire that it couldn't be super readily enforced, but it was also far enough away from Sparta that it wasn't a huge danger.
I thought the Macedonians hadn't kicked off quite yet. Philip definitely hadn't kicked off yet.
No, he didn't. But before that, Macedonia was under someone else's rule. I think they were a Persian allied, or a Persian...
really?
Yeah, some type of Persian ally. So Sparta's like, well, fuck. So they have to end up feeling like they have to come in and help Athens, because if the Persians beat them, they're going to come after the Spartans eventually next.
One step closer.
Yeah.
I find the Persians in this story so interesting because they're almost like the puppet master of Greek descent.
Yeah.
They play both sides. Even though they start by fighting and being repelled kind of by the Athenians and then by the Spartans, they're always the guy with the deep pockets that one of them has
They're
to go
looking
back
for a
to.
new opportunity. They're looking for their Shark Tank, looking for that next product.
And if you can play both sides of the fence, if you can be Mac when they're trying to figure out if D or Dennis is taking Frank's fortune, you can control and weaken both sides at the same time to where when you come in, both sides are going to be inferior to what you have.
Exactly. Yeah, you're weakening them as a whole by pitting them against each other. So 10 years later, after that first Persian invasion, the battle marathon that kicks Persia out of Greece, we get Xerxes, which is where the time frame of the movie 300 comes in, and the Persians end up coming over for the revenge tour against Greece for beating them. So kind of how they don't sail directly across the Aegean because you can't take your army. You can't field a big enough navy to fight against the Athenian navy, and you can't land people and get enough troops together on a beach that could beat the Spartan land army.
Yeah.
So you basically have to. This is one of the craziest things, and I think we probably talked about this in the Athens episode. But when Xerxes was marching this huge, massive, could have been up to 100,000 troop army, they had to cross the Hellespont. And the Hellespont is essentially the section of water that connects, it's the Black Sea to like the Aegean, correct? Because that's kind of where the Byzantine Empire was.
Yeah, the Bosphorus Strait right around there.
That's the one that connects it into the Black Sea, and then I think there's another section, and then the Hellespont is what connects it to that.
Okay.
So that's what connects it directly to the Aegean. Xerxes built a pontoon bridge that got over his like 100,000 man army plus fucking elephants and all that kind of shit. So the time frame it took for this to get prepped was insane. So they're coming in and they have to come all the way up around the Aegean and then march down into Greece. So they're trying to figure out a way to essentially halt the Persian advance. And coincidentally, in the movie, they say that Sparta can't go to war because of like the Carnea or the festival. They had to adhere to these celebrations of the gods in which they weren't able to make war or do anything like that. What it actually was is I think he attacked during the Olympics. And apparently the Olympics were such a huge... Right. Sorry, maybe not the Olympics, but there was a thing called the Olympic truce.
Like yeah, because it was like for training for that event.
Yeah, so no one was able to launch any type of military campaigns. So, yeah, 480 BC is when this happens. So, Leonidas, however you want to say his name, basically has this 300-man group. Now, normally, he does have a personal bodyguard or like elite troop, that marches with him into battle. But normally these 300 are made up of these 20 to 30-year-old fucking studs that are in their prime, still working in the agoge, and these are the guys that surround the king during actual battles.
Super soldiers.
Yes. He understands that if he's going to do anything and be able to march and only take 300 troops with him, he's not turning away Xerxes' army. He can maybe try a delaying tactic. It's going to be a symbolic battle that will try to rally Greece or buy them a little bit more time. I don't know what his thought result in that is.
You heard about his trip to the Oracle at Delphi.
Okay, that's correct. The trip, she dictated that either Sparta would fall or Sparta would lose a king.
Yep.
He was going to choose to, and because he knew it was essentially a death mission, he was going to be the king that was lost to save Sparta.
And the 300 that he actually took with them, instead of being this elite fighting force that you were talking about, and again, this is all speculation, but it sounds like a great story. He went around and chose 300 soldiers who he knew had already had sons.
Yes, I think that was he picked someone whose line was already established. So he had some older dudes in there, but you got to imagine that these were like the grizzled fucking veterans. Yeah. And also you do have young men in their 20s and 30s that have had a son through their marriages and everything. So at that point, even some of those younger guys could actually be in there. So he takes 300 of these guys. This is kind of where the movie departs from the actual historical accuracy of it. So it makes it sound like this stand was these 300 Spartans on their own, this troop fighting against this 100,000 Persian strong army. So as they're moving through Sparta, they have to go up through the Strait of Corinth. They're having to travel a pretty far distance. This isn't the Spartans trying to keep them out of Sparta. This is trying to keep them out of Greece proper. So they marched to this area called Thermopylae. And Thermopylae was known as also the Hot Gates because it was next to like a natural geological hot springs. But basically what it was is the terrain of Greece was like just scrub brush and thorns and all this stuff. It wasn't easy to move through. The mountains were sharp and jagged. And there was this area where the mountains came down. There was a small pass, and then it was the sea on the other side. Very narrow corridor that you could fortify very easily and basically hold against a much larger force. So that's what the Spartans marched here for. Along the way, it wasn't just the Spartans, though. They took with them 900 helots. So basically, these were the guys. I read a book probably like maybe 10 years ago, and it was called like The Hot Gates. And it was the actual depiction. And it does explain they had the helots there because guess what? When they get done fighting for the day, they're not going to come back and make their own food or everything. You have these 300 guys who are going to need to have their wounds taken care of. They're going to need to have their food prepared for them. They're going to need to have their shields fixed. They're going to need to have their swords and their spears repaired and everything.
Yeah, for
All
sure.
of their equipment carried for them that they're having to take. So they have these 900 helots, so basically 3 guys per Spartan as his pit crew here to keep this fucking death machine operating.
They're working his corner. They're massaging his shoulders.
That's
and
exactly
giving him
what
a
it
spit
was.
bucket.
Get in there, rock! You had 700 thespians who are from, is it Thespia is where they're from?
Why would you take 700 actors?
But that's maybe just the name that, they took from.
Oh, okay. So you don't think like these were all stage trained actors that were over there to
They're
like
out
maybe...
there being like, we're gonna kill you, we're gonna kill like doing no. So 700 thespians. Again, these thespians are also part-time soldiers. They're not these professional soldiers. 400 Thebans from Thebes, and then a total of about 4,000 Greeks were actually taking part in the Battle of Thermopylae. They didn't all stay. I think they said about half of them actually left, and then half of them actually probably died.
I think they said there was 1,000 when the first Persian attack hit.
Okay.
So there was 300, and then they were backed up by 700 other Greeks.
Okay. So not counting the helots, because the helots weren't allowed to fight until
they
the
weren't.
very last point. So Leonidas and the 300, along with all these other Greeks, end up holding this pass for 2 full days. On the third day, just like in the movie, it's not a fucking hunchback that's like, sexy. It was a person that had lived in Greece and was offered a shit ton of money and was like, hey, I know a path. I don't have a lot of love for these fucking Spartans. I think they might have said he was even of a descent, what he might have been of like a Mycenae descent or something where a family could have been like related to the Helots. But he basically went to Xerxes and was like, hey, there's a place I can show you that you guys can loop around behind him. So the third day they end up getting trapped in a pincer formation, and all 300 plus whatever Greeks there were still defending that were all killed.
Would you say that the Persians kicked in their back door?
Yes.
Which
should have been nothing new. Yeah. They probably held off the attack for a while.
They were able to defend from behind better than they could defend in front.
But I mean, the losses were actually really staggering, which is why this loss is still known as one of the most famous last stands throughout history, despite being this long ago.
If the numbers weren't
if the numbers are true, but at the same time, we look at warfare today, and I know you can't compare the weaponry and things like that, but they said the position that they were in, and when you look at a picture of it today, you're like, oh man, that's a huge wide front. The Persians could have just charged through that. If you're looking at it, there's a highway that kind of runs next to it. They said the ocean was up to where the highway was, and you can see where it narrows down very, into a very tight corridor. They said it was a perfect strategic position for them to be in, because at any point there were only like a couple dozen guys in the front fighting, and then they would switch positions, and then the new guys would come in, and then they would be able to switch positions. And because of that, it made the Persian numbers basically count for nothing, because they could only get so many guys in there. Not only that, but these Persian soldiers are not professional soldiers like the Spartans are.
Yeah, and they were fighting professional soldiers in the tightest hole in Greece. So, I mean, when you have...
Did you write these down?
No. Okay. No, these are...
You were just thinking of them, or are these coming
as
to you?
As they come, I'm trying to kind of censor some of them, but you have this fighting force that is these Spartans leading the front. There's 300 of them. But these 300 guys have spent their entire lives preparing for this. Their daily life revolves around training to know exactly where you need to be in the line, training to hold your shield up so you're protecting yourself and like your man to the left
It
and then his
overlaps
to
the
the left.
phalanx and everything. And imagine it from this mindset. You know when you were selected for this, you know where you're going. You know what it's going to mean. This is what you're not going to get the headstone like we discussed.
Yeah.
Because this isn't going to be a victory, but you are doing what you were trained to do, and you are, aside from that headstone, you know full goddamn well that you're going to receive the highest honor that a Spartan ever could of dying on the battlefield protecting Sparta and protecting Greece. And they said that when Spartans would die on the battlefield, there's that scene in the movie where she's like, Spartan, come back with your shielder on it. And that's not accurate. It's a great movie line, but it's not accurate for any type of like philosophy that they had. The Spartans
bring
that
the
died,
dead back.
yeah, the Spartans that died on the battlefield were buried on the battlefield. And there was I don't know if it was the Acadians or somebody was like, you know what? We have a lot of dead Spartans buried in our land, as like a flex of saying we've killed a lot of Spartans. And they're like, that's funny. We hardly have any dead Spartans buried on ours, which basically means no one has been able to get to them to have any of the dead Spartans there.
Was it no dead Spartans on our land or no dead Acadians on our land? Like, we haven't had to kill you in our land because you've never gotten closer to me.
But I want to say the Acadians tried to take back their dead. It could have been either or.
Yeah.
Either or works.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole idea of them protecting their land so much and why they didn't need these walls that they had always bragged about because nobody could ever get close, because that's where most of their forces were stationed trying to put down the rebellions. That was the other thing that will come up eventually is when you start getting attacks closer to your homeland and all of those helots see a fighting force coming at you. That's when they're probably going to rebel.
Yeah, exactly.
When they know they got reinforcements coming that are of better
That's like
means.
the people in like Holland when like the Allied soldiers show up. They're just like, hey, we're friends.
Yeah.
We don't like these guys either.
We'll help you out. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We'll get them out of here.
So estimates for the actual battle and everything, between 2,000 and 4,000 casualties for the Greeks, which would be a majority of the Greeks.
Yeah.
And then they said as high as what they could figure, 20,000 for the Persians. Now, that's also based upon what their estimates of the Persian numbers were to begin with. There's been estimates of 100,000, which would still be an insane amount of men to field for this time and to travel them that far. And then there were, Herodotus has said it looked like they were in the millions, or there was 1 million men or something like that.
Just goddamn impossible based on population.
And I think, honestly, we've never seen that many people before. Like,
Yeah.
we get accustomed, we see a college football stadium that could hold 100,000 people, and we look at that and we say, oh, well, we've built that thing that can hold 100,000 people. But when you've never seen with your eyes 100,000 people, it has to look like 1 million to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I could definitely see where you could kind of get those numbers inflated. But after the Persians ended up breaking through there, they would go on to sack Athens, and they ended up losing a naval battle at Salamis. And at that point, Xerxes was like, well, they took out a big portion of our troops. We probably need to go back and lick our wounds. They end up withdrawing back to Asia in 479 BC.
Asia Minor. And here's the thing. I think we talked about the Battle of Salamis, but if you haven't gone back and listened to the Athens episode, go back after this. There's still stuff we don't discuss about. Athens is pretty fucking crazy during like the Peloponnesian War and everything.
Yeah, and I'm sure there will be an episode. We're going to get into the Peloponnesian War here soon. There's going to be an episode that we're just going to have to devote to the Peloponnesian War because it happened. There were so many different things. So this is just going to be another overview kind of from the Spartan point of view of how the Peloponnesian War went.
The Battle of Salamis was basically Athens doing their part of this and defeated the Persian navy in this crazy naval battle where they got them tightened in between these two pieces of land, and it was like a strategic genius move, and it's crazy. Go back and listen to that because we provide some more details on it.
Yeah. So, we are getting to kind of an event that wasn't caused by any political strife or anything like that, But something that always seems to pop around and happen, I think we talked about it during the Byzantine Empire episode. I know we talked about it during the Athenian episode, but earthquakes just happened back then. I don't know if maybe we're flirting around the whole time that these other ones happened. Probably not the Byzantines, because that would be a completely... Well, would it be that different of a time frame? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Because the Romans would have been over in Greece. That was when that would start happening, is in a few centuries.
But it was still a city that was in existence before the Romans took it over. It was just turned into what's-his-name's capital after that. The city was still there.
But these earthquakes just happen. And this earthquake that happens in 464 BCE ends up sparking another revolt at home because the earthquake destroyed most of the city.
Which makes perfect sense because you're building and stacking stone. These aren't, buildings today, wood can flex.
Yep.
And everything. There's codes to build to withstand earthquakes. There's certain things you can do with the foundation and the structure of the building. These are just people that, as phenomenal as they are about creating these works of architectural art, it's still just stacking stone on top of stone and then using some mortar to try to keep it together. But the ground starts fucking moving back and forth, and guess what? Ain't no flexing that in a lot of these places. The cities can get destroyed by this. Some of them rebuild, some of them don't. And some of cities take a hit a lot heavier than others.
Yeah, and Sparta took a pretty big hit. Athenian troops were sent to Sparta to help with the revolt. And again, that sort of pissed the Spartans off because when they went over to try to help the Athenians, they got shut down and told no and told to head back home. And now the Athenians are trying to come in and save the day. They know what's going on in Athens as far as what democracy looks like. And they know that Athens is in these are in these areas in Greece trying to spread their beliefs in democracy and trying to create this Delian League.
There was also this feeling after they defeated Xerxes, was that the Spartans played the prominent role in that victory, both with the combination of the initial assault, Battle of Thermopylae, all that kind of stuff, but then also coming in, and I believe during Salamis, it was because the Spartans were overall, the land forces were more important than the naval forces in the grand scope of things. The Spartans were technically in charge of the naval aspect of it, but I think they kind of let the guys who knew what they were doing. Spartan again. I think basically they were just like, how many troops do you have? Where do you need to get in position? I'm going to let you get up to the details, but here's the plan. Do with it what you will. So Greece is looking to Sparta for a lot of, guidance, and basically looking at them as kind of the main player and the tastemaker in Greece, basically. Yeah. Well, when this earthquake happens, I think Athens looks at that and it says, they're looking pretty weak right now, but we're not going to go ahead and start a war and try to take them out while they're weak. We'll come in looking like we had to help them and that they couldn't have made it through this without us, and then we'll be the ones that are looked to as the problem solvers.
Yeah, definitely. If you help the king and you help build the king back up, everybody around is going to be like, oh, wow, he's pretty good. Mm-hmm. He does some good things.
Why couldn't the king do that?
Yeah. So we get into the First Peloponnesian War between the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League and the Athenian-led Delian League. From 460 to 445 was the First Peloponnesian War. The Athenians opened the war just dominating the sea, just like the playbook. They run their first scripted plays, they're crushing it. They're making it happen. They are also coming out victorious on land. And when you start to win those land battles, too, that you're not expected to, we always hear Spartans are superior on land. They're some of the best soldiers around. And sometimes hard work, that's sort of the opposite. Because talent in Athens wasn't as good as the Spartans, but they just had the numbers. They were going to be able to outmatch them.
You could replace it. It's the same thing for Stalingrad.
Yeah.
You could replace your soldiers. You may not have had the best quality, but you had quantity, and you could replace your losses much easier than the Spartans could.
Well, and you still had, I think, a stronger Delian League than a Peloponnesian League. So you're also talking about not just the two mainstay cities. You're talking about the protection of all the other city-states in the group.
Yeah.
So that kind of goes it's sort of like that for a while. The first big win that the Spartans get is at Tangeray, and that happens in 457. That's their first land victory, so they're kind of starting to get their feet wet. Persian incursion. Once again, there were tensions that arose between the Athenians and the Persians in Egypt in 454. The Athenians ended up signing a truce with Sparta, and it started back up 3 years later. There was fighting from 448 to 445 until they came to what they called the 30 Years Peace Agreement. The way that they did peace agreements back then is so much different than what we do now.
It had a shelf life.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, just so you know, this is when it ends. So be ready to fuck shit up when the fucking timer goes off.
And if anything's happened during this 30 years of truce, day one after the truce is off, if we want to go back to this, if cooler heads haven't prevailed over this 30-year truce, we'll just go ahead and get back in. There were some tensions where the Athenians decided to start poking around some areas in the Peloponnesian areas. They were supporting some revolts. They were down there kind of trying to meddle in an area that Sparta believed should be a part of the truce that they shouldn't be in. Truce ends up falling apart by 431. We have the Second Peloponnesian War. It started and lasted until 404. The Athenian long walls stopped the Spartans on land and kind of turned Athens into its own little island because you had the naval superiority that was holding back any of the other groups in the Peloponnesian navy that were trying to advance that way because the Spartans just didn't have a navy. Mm-hmm. But on land, these giant walls that we talked about in the Athens episode were able to protect the city in such a way that it didn't really matter. It countered everything that the Spartans had to throw at it.
It's so crazy to think that, like, when you're looking at Greece, map of it, you kind of lose focus for what the distance is because everything is so tight together. Fuck, I want to go to Greece so bad and see all that stuff. But Athens was not on the coast. It was more of a landlocked country. And then it had this port that it used and it had these two walls that basically made a highway that was protected by walls on each side that went all the way to Athens. So the Spartans are essentially kind of laying siege to Athens, or maybe not up to that point yet, but spread of disease happens. We talked about that during the episode, is it comes in through the port and just completely destroys and devastates Athens.
They don't remember what it was. Was it like typhoid or typhus?
Yeah, typhus or typhoid, yeah. I think
something that was coming in from Africa from the ports, is that what it was?
Yep. And so Sparta see this and they're like, yeah, we don't want to catch that, but also you guys look pretty messed up. I don't think we're going to have to worry about you guys for a while. And they just end up going back to Sparta. One of the things they also did during this time is, like Adam was saying earlier, the Persians are still just kind of watching this from the sidelines, being like, what are they doing over there? Like, we haven't dipped our toes in a couple years into Greece. So they're looking here and they're like, they're fighting each other again. Sweet. Spartans are like, we can't compete without having a navy, but we don't have the funding and resources to do this. So they go to the Persians and basically get funding and get supplies to be able to create this navy and to buy people that can sail and all that kind of stuff, so they can have it, be on par from a naval, position as Athens.
They float them alone.
Yes.
Part of the reason why they became kind of on par with the Athenian navy was the Athenians tried to roll down into Sicily and take Syracuse and free all their slaves and cause a revolt.
It's weird talking about this from the other side.
Yeah.
Because we talked about it from the Athenian side, and as much as you don't try to look at good guys, bad guys kind of in history, because it's never black and white, and it's very rare for circumstances like World War II to see good guys, bad guys, you look at this, and when we're talking about Athens, you're looking at Sparta almost as the bad guys. And every Athenian loss, you're like, fuck, they lost. Looking at it here and knowing some of the things that Athens also did and seeing it from this perspective, like that island that Athens went to and completely just murdered everybody on the island and just did genocide on the entire populace of the island. And that turned a bunch of the Delian League, and they were just kind of like, fucking A, Athens, like, simmer.
Yeah.
But you see these other perspectives of the battle and you're like, oh, okay, yes, Athens lost.
Mm-hmm. It's totally in the perspective, and that's why history most of the time should be two-sided, and you should hear things. There's certain kinds of history that you don't need to hear both sides, again, i.e. World War II. we talk about both sides of everything just because it is really interesting, but there's definitely some propaganda going both directions in this. Both of them probably weren't great, but that was just how societies were back then.
Yeah.
So this trip down to Syracuse ends up being a pretty big naval loss just because Syracuse, being on Sicily, is going to be more of a naval power and a naval threat because they're allowed to build boats being on an island down there.
But you're also further away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your run's further away, you're fighting a more on par navy, and you end up losing some boats that would just weaken your league greatly. And then you add in the Persians sneaking a little money into the Spartan pockets, providing enough funding for them to go purchase boats and to stock them with their city-state of choice. You build yourself a navy that can then match a weakened Delian navy. And from there on out, it's just kind of boom, boom, boom for the Spartans. They end up, when Athens was at its peak, when the Delian League was at its peak, the Peloponnesians tried to sue for peace. They kind of saw the writing on the wall. They didn't want to keep going on. Once they end up taking over and they're sitting in the driver's seat, they again try to sue for peace. So they don't want this fight.
Yeah.
Because they know that they need all of their troops back home to try to stop any sort of uprisings that are going on back home.
Not only that, but I think they also do see, regardless of working with the Persians, you're taking the money. It's dirty money, but it's money, and you need it. If you lose this battle, you can't be in a position to worry about future battles.
Yeah.
I think they're also looking at this from the perspective of saying, we can't lose any more guys because we need all the help we can get back home. We also can't afford to keep killing your guys because if we kill enough of you and you kill enough of us, when our fucking bank decides to invade again, we're not going to be able to resist them. So it's almost like looking out for the entirety of Greece for their autonomy. Not personally being like, we want Athens to survive, but being like, fuck, we actually kind of need Athens if this, we've needed Athens during the first two times that these people have tried to invade. We're going to need them again.
Even if we end up winning this, every boat that you sink, we have to pay for.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe we both cut our losses.
Every boat we sink, we have to build. Yeah.
Athens says no. And when Athens says no, the Peloponnesian League squashes the Delians. They take Athens. Instead of doing what they would usually do and enslaving them and turning them into their subjects. Oh, that was the other part of Sparta that was so unique compared to all the other Greeks. This episode might be 3 hours long because we keep having these asides. But this was interesting to me. The difference was when the Athenians would take somebody over and they would enslave them, they'd sell slaves.
Yeah. Outside of Greece.
They would sell them outside of Greece. They would be moving them. Whereas whenever the Spartans would get them, they would keep them in-house. So you have this ability to put them in positions to allow your army and your wives to be able to do what they wanted. Whereas the Athenians still had jobs because all the slaves that they would get in war, instead of bringing them back and doing the same thing that the Spartans would do, they just sold them off at a profit.
Yeah.
So it makes the dichotomy just that much more... I don't know. They're just spreading further and further out in the way that they do things. But the Spartans and the Peloponnesian League decide to put these 30 tyrants, these pro-Spartan Athenians in power in Athens. And we talked about all that in the episode.
I when they do the second suing for peace, I just see Athens as Randy Marsh when he's a beat to shit and he's like, I didn't hear no bell.
I thought this is America.
Yeah, that's all I see there. So they end up installing these 30 basically puppet rulers.
Yep.
So Sparta is basically ruling Athens. They don't do what the Persians did and raise it to the ground or anything like that. They realize that if they can control Athens, they also control the strength of Athens and the economy of Athens, so it's going to just make them more powerful.
And I think, in that Athens episode, we talked about how that didn't work and how those guys ended up getting shook. But at the same time, this puppetry that they were running over in Athens kind of showed everybody else in Greece. This is the start of, I believe the word's hegemony?
Hegemony.
Of Greece and Athens, of Sparta in Greece.
Yeah.
To where they're the ultimate leading power. Spartans ended up repaying the Persians by backing the wrong Persian horse that was going for the kingship in Persia. And once they did that, the Persians that ended up taking power came in and just smoked Greece.
Yeah.
They were not very happy about this. They ended up losing the battle for Greek independence. Other Greek city-states that were in good with the Persians were like, these guys are better than the Spartans.
Yeah.
These guys aren't banging each other when they show up to see what's going on.
These guys also aren't living in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
So we're still going to have some of the freedom and autonomy. Like, what's Persian rule going to be? We send a little bit more money to the Persians instead of the Spartans. Spartans also can't march. Spartans can march over here pretty quickly if they needed to. If there's a domestic dispute, Persia's really got to be like, fuck, it's got to really be serious for us to send someone over there.
Well, at the same time, too, they're not getting up when the rooster crows and doing 50 push-ups and running laps and on the Spartan training regimen. But it also, I think, sort of changed Sparta a little bit when they had this power, because as they were traveling around and they were seeing what other armies did and how other armies trained and feeling that they were superior, but at the same time, they see how other city-states are doing things. Mm-hmm. I think part of that, the Spartans saw, were like, wow, you guys actually, like, have lives. Your training's different. We have lives, but all of our lives are focused around being able to show up and help the militia at any time. You guys have a little bit more fulfillment of, like, living a full, rounded-out life.
Yeah.
You see struggle, and it's bad, but at the same time, you're not as strict. You guys have a little bit more fun in your lives, I think.
And Sparta is consistently getting weaker.
Yeah.
This entire time, because they can't replace their losses like these other places can. Like, there's so much invested into each of these Spartans that it's not just like there's one waiting to replace them or the three that they just lost in battle. So as they just generally get weaker, not only is the threat from within with the revolts from the Helots and everything, now they're having, Persia basically backing all these Greek forces against Sparta in the Corinthian War. So the Corinthian, how we stated, the Strait of Corinth is what separates the main portion of Greece that's locked onto Asia and Europe and everything from the strip that's kind of, or the Peloponnese is.
You think that had anything to do with 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the Bible?
Maybe the people from that area. I'm not sure how that relates.
Huh. I didn't ever think about that.
But yeah, so 395 to 387. Again, we're counting down because we're still before Common Era. So that's when the Persians are basically like, yeah, go to town, take out Sparta. So once the Athenians basically begin recapturing, because they're kind of taking the lead on this. Yeah. Athens has kind of built itself back up, and they're like, hey, we took the lead before in these battles against Sparta. We have experience with them. Why don't you let us do this thing? So as they start recapturing these old dealing league strongholds, the Persians, again, basically are throwing support behind the Spartans. So they're switching. They're like, Athens is getting too powerful. Let's go ahead and weaken them a little bit. So then they turn right around. They're like, Sparta, do you need anything in this battle?
Puppet master.
Yeah.
Whole entire thing. They're starting this whole Delian Peloponnesian thing all over again, and they bounce back and forth to see how many guys they can knock out on either side.
Yeah.
And they do it really with ease, because as soon as they threw their support behind the Spartans, the allies moved to sue for peace, with Sparta maintaining their hegemony.
It's like playing a board game by yourself, and you're playing both sides of it, and so you're both just like, how much can I get these guys to beat each other up?
Except for it's not quite playing chess against yourself, because I think there's a hell of a lot of thought that goes in that. This is more of a checkers game.
Yeah.
Because it's very
Risk.
basic.
This is Risk.
Yeah.
You're playing Risk by yourself.
Sparta's population, as Chris alluded to, begins to decline. As a steady number of the Helots, who never lost because they weren't going out and dying in battle, just kept growing.
Well, here's the thing, too. The Helots could revolt, and you kill 100 Helots. But if you lose 25 Spartans, proportionately, you've lost a lot more Spartans than you have Helots.
So the numbers keep getting worse. These wars that they're going out and fighting, these skirmishes they're losing men in. And Sparta and Athens team up once more. They're such strange bedfellows every time they team up, because of all the dirt, that happens in between the two of them. Like they have to team up. They're the two main forces, and they have to keep fighting. They ultimately lose, and general peace between all of the allies and enemies in Greece, except for the Spartans, who refused to recognize an area that was the Messian.
That was like the entire western portion of like the Peloponnese,
which is where they got the Helots from.
Yeah.
So, of course, they refuse to join that.
Getting a lot of Confederate States of America vibes a little bit from this.
Yeah. So, this last war that they fought ends up in peace. Except the Spartans are so goddamn hard-headed that it doesn't matter what goes on. They're never going to get onto it. They never got on with they never got on with the Persians when they came in. Mm-hmm. That was always a fight. They never wanted to see Athens get any bigger than them because that was going to be the fight. And now everybody in Greece besides them is all on one side, and they can't fight and beat everybody in Greece, so they just take their ball and go home.
And what do you do when your whole society is based upon creating a strong military? Well, I'm getting echoes of current times right now. But when you are completely dictated on building a military, and all of a sudden that becomes not obsolete because you're always going to need that, but that doesn't become the main battlefield anymore. What if all of a sudden the main battlefield becomes economics or, trade? All that kind of stuff that maybe wasn't as important when people were trying to kill each other, but now that, that's kind of the way a city becomes prosperous and a country becomes powerful, because if you have a strong economy and a trade relationships, you're making more money, which means that you can just hire people to also fight your battles for you. And with these areas, I think like Athens trying to kind of change with the times, but Sparta feeling like it cracked the formula. It had the right recipe from the get-go. It just seems like they progressed themselves. They're still running a program on their computer just out of like the habit of running it. Like, I don't want to upgrade to the new program because it's going to change and there's going to be stuff about it that I'm not familiar with. And I think because of that and the way that they lived, it was effective at one time, but because they didn't adapt, that's why you essentially just kind of see the deterioration.
Does this have anything to do with you having an iPhone 4 when the iPhone 16 came out?
It was when the iPhone 10 came out,
first
of all.
My
the
bad.
iPhone 16 hasn't even released, so you sound like a fool.
Sorry.
No, but what happened
bad.
there, listen, I have a very good reason for that. They kept making them bigger and bigger, and not until the 10 did they make one the same size as like the 4 or the 5, and so then I upgraded.
So the Spartans were just waiting for democracy to quit growing and start coming back down to earth.
It didn't.
It didn't. No.
They didn't design a democracy pro.
Well, when you look at it in current times, I mean, now instead of having the same fight of a monarchy, a diarchy, and democracy, like, we're still split. It's just democracy and communism now.
Here's the other thing, too. There's always going to be a bigger fish because there's someone that your eye hasn't been on.
Yeah.
You've been fighting each other down there in the south of Greece. Persia's been periodically popping in, but at certain points, Persia might have problems on the other side of Persia, and they're weakened. And there's a country that rolls in all of a sudden that wasn't like a huge player, that kind of sat everything out and was just like, you guys are just beating the shit out of each other. They get strong, and this is where we lead into Philip II of Macedonia. And this is going to tie directly into Alexander the Great. This is how close all of this stuff is together within this ancient history. Philip II is the father of Alexander the Great. So you essentially get Philip II coming in, and Macedonia sits kind of at the, I guess I could say, the root of the shaft that is Greece. Would that make sense?
It feels right for this episode.
And so the first natural place that Philip is going to go on campaign is going to be south, because all of that area is essentially, people can't go anywhere.
Yep.
He's moving in from the north, and there's no place to go. There's just the sea anywhere you look. So
you head south, you're headed right into Persian territory again. So
you
can't
go up
go
and south, yeah.
Well, I think
Alexander ends up doing.
Yeah.
Because Alexander ends up taking this recipe of an empire that his father kind of starts to establish and then really just runs with it. But Sparta, being Sparta, is just like, no, like we're Sparta. Like we're not going to become a vassal state for somebody else. And that kind of hard-headedness is probably not going to be tolerated by the new kid in town.
It is admirable, though. If you're wrong, if you put your head down and just keep pushing forward, somehow they did it. Philip II in Macedonia never took Sparta. They took everywhere around them. They basically, Sparta was just an island, basically in the Greek Macedonian Empire.
Was it a World War II Japanese situation where we looked at it as like, fuck, if we try to take that, we're going to incur so many losses, we're not going to be conquering any place else.
Yeah, except for Philip didn't have an atomic bomb.
Had he had that, I'm assuming he would have dropped it on Sparta.
I don't even think he would have thought twice. Nope. It would have happened immediately. That would have been the Trojan horse. It was just an atomic bomb that they dropped at the Spartan gate. They also refused to join the Macedonian created League of Greeks that fought against the Persians. So even when it came to the one thing that they supposedly enjoyed doing and did the best over anybody else, fighting in war, they're like, no, we still got to stay home because the Helots are still growing and we're still declining in numbers.
I was going to say, I feel like that's why, but I feel like Sparta couldn't participate in that because they would have shown what their strength was and what they were able to send, and they would have been like, oh, you guys are fucked, you're weak, we're coming after you next. Like, we should have invaded you.
Yeah. And just along those lines, continued defense against these Macedonian forces that just kept coming in and kept trying to take this place, coupled with this social crisis at home where this whole idea of these 9,000 equal plots that were given out to all these soldiers and all these citizens. When there's less citizens, there becomes more land. When there's more land up for grabs, it starts getting concentrated into the more rich people that are running the place. So instead of everybody being equals and everybody being the same, not necessarily same ranks, but equals within the military to where it kind of makes it hard for like a general to be above everybody else.
Yeah. How does that work though too? So like, yeah, your citizen numbers start to dwindle, which means there's less people to run all the plots, which you're like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to assign these plots to these people and they're going to gain this. Then once you get your numbers to start bouncing back up, even if you get to that point, what do you start taking the plots back away and giving, like, that's going to cause political unrest as well.
Yeah, do you make the plots bigger and try to even things out?
Yeah.
Or the about 100 or so people that are the major controlling stake in Sparta, you're not going to give that up. Mm-hmm. Well, why in the world would you give that up? You took all this time to amass all that land. You're not going to split it anymore. And basically what this was just the number of citizens had plummeted to around like 700 when the peak was 9,000.
Yeah, you just are so stringent with what makes you a citizen and what qualifies that when you have a smaller pool to pull from, what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah, you're 700 troops that you're sending out there, 700 Spartites.
And you're much less likely to even send one of those out now.
Mm-hmm. So you really can't do much. Political reforms to try to separate this wealth. We're just plugging all of these holes that are in the Spartan ship now. You're sticking a finger in a hole and then another one pops open.
You only got 700.
Yeah.
There's more holes than 700.
There's not a lot that you can do. And then during the 2nd century BCE, Sparta fell under the control of Rome. And this was probably the saddest thing about this whole episode. I know there's been a lot of death and a lot of pederasty and things like that. Also very sad. But they were almost used as like a Renaissance fair of what Sparta used to be, where the Romans would actually travel down into Sparta and there would be like public displays of the training camps.
What's that place that people can go to? It's supposed to
Medieval
be like
times?
colonial. No, it's Colonial Williamsburg.
Oh, yeah.
It's basically like Colonial Williamsburg. Sparta becomes Williamsburg, where you can just walk in there and it's like, oh, I'm transported back in time. Isn't this how quaint this is all working?
And this was the Greek peak that the Romans wanted to go see. They had heard these legends of Sparta. They wanted to see how it went. And this was just a show that they would put on. One of the things that we didn't talk about in the schooling, the Agoge, did you hear about the race that they would have between the kids where they would fill their mouth up with water?
Oh, yes.
And this was to train them against their urges. This is going way back, but I'm sure they did this at this time, so I'm going to qualify this as something that they did. What they would do would be they would set off on this race across mountain terrain and all this, and what they would do is each kid would take a mouthful of water, and as they ran, the whole idea was they had to make it to the finish line with the water still in their mouths.
Spit out the water at the finish line.
Never taking a drink.
Remember the movie Out Cold? The very beginning,
Yeah.
the king of the mountain, and he holds the beer in his mouth while he's snowboarding, then spits it into the cup at the end to be king of the mountain.
Shit.
There you go.
Huh. I haven't thought about Out Cold in forever.
Yeah. Well, Rome's going to do what Rome's going to do when it establishes its empire. We're going to skip quite a ways ahead because we're going to the 13th century.
Well, part of that was they weren't a power anymore. They didn't provide writing their own history. So they kind of become lost to history because there's nothing remarkable that's going on. There's no renaissance that's happening where populations are growing. They're just subsisting in an area where they're just a small militia that Roman lords are hiring to go cause some disturbances in other places.
You also have a place where what used to be nothing but Spartan influence and their way of life, you now have that mixed in with Roman culture and everything. So it's diluting it. So now people are looking at this and you're probably getting generations that are like, I don't want to go to the fucking Agoge. Mm-hmm. Like or someone was put through the Agoge and when they have children, they're just like, this looks more appealing, and they take their family and start living the Roman, and you start to lose not only people that you can't replace due to just natural causes, now you're losing them to differences in culture that look more appealing.
I can't really blame them. I don't think Sparta would have been a super fun place unless you went through the hell of school to get to it being enjoyable.
12 years is fucking murder.
Yeah.
12 years of school, and you think 23, and you get your ass beat.
And you don't ever get to go home.
Yeah.
And you got to sleep with a bunch of dudes. Both metaphorically and verbally or physically.
You're fingering, you're getting fingered, you're exploring each other's bodies.
You want to find a different way out of that. But
unless you're into that. And then maybe you want to find your way back into that.
Those were the true Spartans, were the ones that stayed.
Yep.
And still went to the school, and there was just like 3 of them.
It's the dudes wearing their Letterman jackets that are still hanging out and watching the football practices. Yeah.
There's like a 32-year-old that's still in school because he keeps getting held back because there's nothing else for him to do.
And I mean, by the 13th century, Common Era, the political center of Laconia ends up being moved from Sparta. So there's even recognition that this is kind of part of the past.
That's tough, man.
Yeah, it is. Especially when that has been that place has been such a focal point in your country for so long. But again, maybe that's them trying to separate themselves into a common era. And 1834, jumping ahead again, we get the Greek Revolution. Basically brought calls from the Greek king Otto to grow the city of Sparta once more, to revitalize the ancient culture of Greece.
I love that that's what the Greeks do when they gain their independence finally, is they want to reinstate old Greece. They want to bring back former glories because those are the stories that they still heard when they were under Ottoman rule, I believe at that point. Mm-hmm. And those are the enduring stories that help you remember your culture. So as soon as you're able to start practicing your culture again, what do? You rebuild one of the greatest civilizations that ever happened in your country for nationalism.
Yeah, something symbolically known of your country.
Which, it's a great thing that they did. Greek people are endlessly interesting. Stav helps me get a lot of Greek fix. I listen to this.
Get you a peek into the Greek?
Yeah. I listen to him to get ready for these Greek episodes pretty heavy. But today, it's still around. It's known as an economic, administrative, and cultural center of Laconia again. This time, instead of LACONIA, it's LAKONIA. The population is around 33,000. It's not. I mean, it's more of a blue collar, I would say, kind of city now.
You don't often see cities like that have the same, if not a smaller population. And again, that's not citizens, because at a certain point they had actual Spartan citizens during that. But it's kind of interesting because normally those places that are kind of landmark places in your country are constantly growing. You normally don't see a place just kind of stay.
And it endured somehow enough to where it saw the other side. It went through Greek independence to Greeks being under control by the Macedonians, by the Romans, by the Ottomans, and then they come out on the other side and they're still around.
Little fun fact before we leave you guys, I just thought it was kind of funny. So apparently there was a small little battle or skirmish that took place at Thermopylae, just like a small distance away from the hot gates where Leonidas was, between the British Commonwealth forces in World War II and the Nazis.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So that just the parallel of knowing that strategic position, everything like that. But can you imagine you're the Germans who have had this whole Spartan lore put into your society about this, the eugenics, the master race, all this kind of stuff finds a lot of its rooting in Sparta. And at the same time, you're on the Persian side of it. And the Brits are just come and take them. Come and take them, old chaps.
I mean, it's so perfect to know that happened so many, a couple of millennia, almost a couple of millennia later, definitely a couple millennia later, that this one spot in history that was such a big deal between the Persians and the Greeks now finds itself a modern day choke point where another world battle is going to take place. Yeah. It's that's just what that place was meant for, was just those kinds of battles happening there. Yeah. If in another 100 years, God forbid, something breaks out and somehow they find themselves at the gates again in Greece.
There's third battle of Thermopylae. There's
it's just always going to be that same place.
All right, man. You got anything else?
No, I'm glad we got back to Greece. This was a great way to get back into Greece. Sparta was something that it was on my radar as far as the movie and a little bit of that. Football teams love the Spartans. I mean, there's a ton of Spartan colleges. It's always been a big symbol of power and superiority, and to just know how they got there and why they got there and why it wasn't as true, but the stories are just that good about them that it's brought them that kind of prestige. It was fun to figure it all out.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us on another episode. We'll catch you next week.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.